Silas Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Ashwood Creek's main house swung open like he already owned it, and in his mind, maybe he did. He dropped a folded document onto Lenora Whitlock's kitchen table with the flat, satisfied sound of a man delivering a verdict. 3 weeks, he said, smoothing his coat like the whole thing bored him. That's how long before this place gets auctioned off. I've already spoken to the bank. I've already spoken to every buyer in the territory. He smiled at her, not a kind smile, the other kind. You don't have to thank me for the warning, Lenora. Just be reasonable. Lenora didn't pick up the paper. She looked at him steadily, her hands resting still on the back of a kitchen chair. Get out of my house, Silas. He laughed, turned for the door, paused. My offer stands until Friday. After that, he glanced around the room with something that wasn't quite pity. I'll just wait. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people fight back against men who think money makes them untouchable, then hit subscribe before this video goes any further. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a like. Then tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all really began. The morning Dawson Rourke decided to leave, he woke up before the sun. That was normal. He'd been waking up before the sun for the better part of 20 years, in bunkhouses and camp bedrolls, and once, memorably, under an overturned wagon during a hailstorm outside of Cheyenne. Early mornings were the one thing that stayed consistent across all the places he'd been and all the seasons he'd worked. The light came up gray and cold and indifferent, and Dawson got moving before it did, because standing still had never suited him. He dressed in the dark. Wool shirt, worn canvas pants, the boots he'd resoled twice himself because they fit right, and breaking in new ones was a misery he didn't need. He moved quietly, which was habit. The bunkhouse at Ashwood Creek held 2 other hands, young men named Cody and Pete, who slept the way young men sleep, like something had unplugged them. Dawson didn't want to wake them. He didn't want conversation this morning. He didn't want much of anything except to get his horse fed and his saddlebags checked and his mind clear before what was going to be a hard day. The job offer had come by letter 2 weeks earlier. Cattle operation near Laramie, substantially larger than Ashwood Creek, good pay, and the kind of work Dawson knew how to do in his sleep. He'd written back the same afternoon he received it. Didn't think about it much. That was also habit. He crossed the yard without a lamp. He knew the ground well enough, the slight dip near the water trough, the loose board on the fence rail by the second gate, the way the barn door wanted to catch on its bottom edge if you didn't lift it slightly as you pulled. 3 years of learning a piece of ground. He knew Ashwood Creek the way he knew the inside of his own coat pocket. That thought sat uncomfortably as he stepped into the barn. He lit a single lantern low and went to his horse first. Dusty was a plain-looking bay gelding with no remarkable qualities except that he was reliable, patient, and had never once thrown Dawson in 15 years of hard riding. Dawson ran a hand along his neck while Dusty ate, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed. He was checking the stitching on his left saddlebag when he heard the creak of the barn door behind him. He didn't turn immediately. Something in him already knew. Early to be packing, Lenora said. Her voice was level. Couldn't read it, which wasn't unusual. Lenora Whitlock had a way of keeping her voice even when her face didn't quite match. He'd noticed that about her somewhere in the first month he'd been here, and he'd filed it away, alongside 100 other small observations he'd never done anything useful with. Turned. She was standing in the barn doorway in her riding coat, her chestnut hair loose instead of pinned, which meant she'd either just woken up or she'd never gone to sleep. Lantern light caught the edge of her face. She was looking at his saddlebags. Heading out early, Dawson said. Figured I'd get miles on the first day. Miles to Laramie. Not a question, that's right. She was quiet for a moment. She stepped into the barn but didn't come close. Stopped near the stall of one of her mares, put a hand on the rail, and looked at the horse instead of at him. You wrote them back the same day the letter arrived, she said. Cody saw you riding to the post office. Cody should mind his business. Cody is 22. Minding his business isn't something he's figured out yet. A pause. You didn't mention it to me. Didn't think I needed to. You've hired seasonal hands before. Men come and go. They do, she said, still looking at the mare. Is that what you are, seasonal? The question landed differently than he expected. He turned back to the saddlebag and tightened a strap that didn't need tightening. It's a good job, Lenora. Bigger operation, better pay. I'm not questioning the job. Then what are you questioning? Finally looked at him. Direct, which was her way when she'd made up her mind about something. Why you didn't tell me before you'd already decided. Dawson didn't have an answer to that one. Or rather, he had an answer, and it was not one he intended to give her. The honest answer was that he hadn't told her, because telling her would have made it harder to go through with, and going through with it was the right thing to do. He'd been telling himself that for 2 weeks, and he mostly believed it. Position starts the 1st of next month, he said. I've got time to help Cody and Pete get the fall fencing done before I head out. I'm not worried about the fencing. You should be. That section near the creek is Dawson. His name in her mouth, flat and quiet, stopped him. I know about the fencing. I've been managing this ranch for 4 years. I know every inch of fence line on this property. She let that settle. I'm asking you why you didn't tell me. He faced her properly. It was harder than it should have been, and he was aware of that, and it irritated him. Lenora Whitlock was 30 years old, stood a few inches shorter than him, and had green eyes that had a way of making him feel like she could see past whatever expression he was using. He'd developed a pretty convincing neutral expression over the years. It had worked on most people. It had never fully worked on her. Because it's my decision to make, he said. And I made it. Something shifted in her face. Something tightened. All right, she said. She looked at him for another second, then nodded once that short, sharp nod she used when she was closing a door in her mind and turned to go. Lenora, she stopped. Didn't turn. He had nothing to follow it with. He'd said her name the way a man reaches for something he's already dropped, knowing he won't catch it. I'll finish the north fence line before I ride out, he said. A long pause. I know you will, she said, and walked out into the dark. He didn't sleep after that. He sat on the edge of his cot in the bunkhouse while Cody and Pete snored on, and he stared at his hat on the hook and thought about how much he hated himself sometimes. It wasn't a new feeling. He'd carried it in various forms for a long time, the particular self-loathing of a man who is aware of his own flaws and has decided to live with them instead of fixing them. At 40, Dawson Rourke had made a kind of peace with what he was, a drifter. A capable man who could work any job on a cattle operation, fix most things that broke, read weather and horses and angry men with equal accuracy, and then move on when the season ended. He was good at it. He'd been doing it for so long that staying in one place had started to feel like something that happened to other kinds of people. Then he'd come to Ashwood Creek. He'd taken the job meaning to stay one season, same as everywhere else. Lenora's father, Harlan Whitlock, had been alive then. A big man going to thin with age, sharp enough to read a situation, proud enough to make working for him feel like working with him. Dawson had respected Harlan immediately and deeply. Harlan had a way of treating a man's time like it was worth something. And then Harlan had gotten sick, and the season extended, and Dawson had found himself picking up tasks that weren't his job because there was no one else. Staying a bit later, starting a bit earlier, getting up in the middle of a February night to help Lenora drag a colic-sick horse around the yard because leaving the animal lying down would kill it. They'd walk that horse for 4 hours in the dark and the cold, saying almost nothing to each other, and somewhere around 3 in the morning the horse had passed the crisis, and they'd both leaned against the fence in exhausted silence. And Dawson had thought, very simply and very quietly, I don't want to be anywhere else right now. That thought had frightened him, so he'd filed it away. Harlan died in March of the following year. Lenora had stood at his grave with her jaw tight and her eyes dry, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she was the kind of person who needed to stay upright in front of other people and fell apart later, in private. Dawson knew that about her. He didn't know how he knew it, exactly. He just paid attention. After Harlan was buried, Dawson had told himself again that he'd stay until things stabilized. Practical thing to do. The ranch needed hands, and Lenora needed support, and it was just the decent thing. That's what he told himself. He didn't examine it beyond that, because examining things like that led to understanding things that were more comfortable, not understood. The core problem that he could not logic his way around, was Lenora herself, not her appearance, though he was not blind. Lenora Whitlock was the kind of woman who stopped conversations when she walked into a room, and she seemed genuinely unaware of it, which somehow made it worse. She rode better than most men he'd worked with. She could look at a sick horse and know what was wrong before he could. She had her father's sharpness without any of the hardness that sometimes came with it. She was patient in a way Harlan hadn't been.
Patient in a way that made you feel like she'd actually thought about you before she decided how to treat you.
She was also unmistakably out of his league. That was the plain fact he kept returning to. Dawson Rourke had nothing. He'd been traveling light his whole life, which meant he'd accumulated nothing of substance, no land, no savings worth mentioning, no name that meant anything in any particular county. He had his horse, his tools, his skill, and the clothes he stood in. Lenora Whitlock owned a ranch, understood horses at a level that bordered on gifted, and could have chosen from men throughout the territory who were better situated, better settled, better in every practical sense than an aging cowboy who kept his whole life in a pair of saddlebags. So he'd stayed, and he'd kept his feelings so deeply tamped down that on most days he genuinely could convince himself they weren't there. And when Silas Vane had started coming around with his money and his smooth manners and his obvious intentions, something that was not quite jealousy and not quite despair had settled in Dawson's chest, and he'd made himself look at that feeling plainly and decide what to do with it. The answer he'd come to was Laramie. He wasn't running. That's what he kept telling himself. He was removing himself from a situation before it became a problem. He was giving Lenora the space to make sensible choices without his presence complicating things. He was doing the right thing. He was also, if he was being honest, scared. But that was the part he was choosing not to look at. Breakfast was Cody burning bacon and Pete complaining about it, which was normal, and Lenora sitting at the head of the table with a coffee cup and her ranch ledger and not looking at Dawson, which was not normal. She looked at the ledger instead, made small notations with a pencil. Cody and Pete didn't notice anything, because Cody and Pete noticed very little that didn't directly concern them. Dawson ate. He thanked her for the coffee. She said, "You're welcome," without looking up. The word sat between them like a stone. He went out after breakfast and spent the morning on the north fence line, which genuinely needed work. He hadn't lied about that. He dug new post holes where the old posts had rotted at the base, tamped them in, ran fresh wire. Hard work. The kind that required enough concentration that you couldn't think too hard about other things. Except that he kept thinking about other things. Around midday, he heard hooves and looked up to see Lenora coming along the fence line on her gray mare, moving at an easy walk. She stopped a few yards from him. Sat the horse the way she sat all horses, like she'd been born on one. "You eat?" she said. "Not hungry. That's not what I asked." He stabbed the post hole digger into the ground. "No." She reached into her coat pocket and held out a wrapped cloth that turned out to be bread and cold roast meat. Took it. She didn't leave. She walked her mare a few paces away and let the animal graze while he ate. "I heard from Silas this morning," she said. Dawson kept his eyes on the bread. He wants an answer by Friday about his offer." "Yes. What are you going to tell him?" Lenora looked across the pasture. "I'm still thinking." Dawson nodded. He didn't say anything. He had 100 things pressing against the inside of his teeth, and he let none of them out. He could erase the debt, she said. It wasn't the tone of a woman convincing herself. It was the tone of a woman testing something, maybe testing him. The mortgage, the operating debt, all of it. He told me he'd bring in his own foreman, but that Cody and Pete could stay on. "What about you?" She looked at him then. "What about me? Would you stay on at your own ranch as what?" A pause. His wife. The word landed the way he'd expected it to, and he kept his face still. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "Careful. Very careful." Lenora was quiet for a long moment. A muscle in her jaw worked slightly. "I want to keep this ranch. My father spent 30 years building it. I'm not ready to hand it to a bank." She turned the mare back toward the house. "I'm not sure Silas and I are compatible, but I'm not sure that's the most important question right now." "Lenora, finish the fence," she said, not unkindly. "Just done with the conversation. I'll have supper on before dark." He watched her right away. He thought, "Say it. Just say it. Tell her why Silas is a mistake and why you're a different kind of mistake, and let her sort out the difference." He didn't say it. He picked up the post hole digger. Silas Vane arrived unannounced at 4 o'clock, which was his style. He rode into the yard on a well-bred black horse with silver-fitted tack, and he didn't tie the horse himself because he had a man with him for that. He was 45 thick through the chest, well-dressed in the way that men are when they've been wealthy long enough that it stops looking like effort. He had a broad, somewhat handsome face, with small eyes that were used to getting what they looked at. Dawson was coming in from the north pasture when Silas's man was tying the horse. They saw each other across the yard. Silas's small eyes moved over him with the flat appraisal of a man pricing livestock. "Rourke," Silas said. "Vane, heading out, I hear." Dawson stopped walking. "Who told you that?" Silas smiled with his mouth. "Small territory. Word gets around." He glanced toward the house. "Might be good timing, all things considered. Lenora's going to need to make some decisions about the ranch's direction. Having a brief pause, seasonal hand around, can complicate those conversations." The way he said seasonal hand was precise and deliberate, and they both knew it. Dawson looked at him for a long moment. "She make her decision yet?" "Not formally." Silas smoothed his jacket. "But she will. She's a practical woman. Once she sets aside the sentiment." Another one of those thin smiles. "Sentiment is a luxury for people who don't have mortgage payments." "That's one way to look at it," Dawson said. He walked past Silas and into the barn without another word. He stood in the near dark, with his hand on Dusty's stall, and waited until he heard Silas knock on the main house door. Then he pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the stall frame and breathed. He thought about Harlan, about what Harlan would say if he were here. He thought Harlan would probably be direct about it. In the plain-spoken way he'd probably say, "Dawson, you damned fool. What are you doing?" He didn't have an answer for that either. Supper was quiet. Silas had left before whatever conversation he'd had with Lenora. It had been short. Lenora moved around the kitchen with a controlled efficiency she used when she was working something out in her mind. She served food and talked to Cody and Pete about the morning's work, and asked questions about the fence line and listened to the answers with part of her attention. Dawson watched her and said very little and hated the situation thoroughly. After supper, when Cody and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and it was just the two of them at the cleared table with the remains of the coffee, Lenora got up and went to the small wooden desk in the corner of the room. She opened the lower drawer. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. Then she closed the drawer and sat back down. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table. "Are you packed?" she asked. Mostly. I've still got things in the bunkhouse. And the tack room. So tomorrow morning then. First light. Conditions are good." She nodded, that short, sharp nod again. "Then I need you to do something for me," she said. Her voice was still steady, but something around the edges of it wasn't quite right. "What's that?" "Come back to the house after you finish packing tonight." She stopped. Started again. "There's something I should have given you a long time ago. And if you're leaving tomorrow, I can't keep it until I can't keep holding on to it." Dawson studied her face. "What is it? Just come back." She stood up, taking her cup with her. "Please." He watched her go down the hall. He sat alone at the table for a while, listening to the house settle. He went back 2 hours later. The main house was dim, most of the lamps turned down except one on the kitchen table. Lenora was sitting at the table with a cup she wasn't drinking from, and in front of her, between her hands, was an envelope. Old paper, yellowed at the edges, folded and unfolded enough times that the crease lines had softened. She looked up when he came in. Dawson pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He looked at the envelope. "What is that?" Her jaw tightened for just a moment. Then she slid it across the table toward him. "My father wrote it," she said. "Before he died." Dawson didn't touch it. He looked at it. His name was written on the front in Harlan Whitlock's hand, large, careful letters, the handwriting of a man who didn't write much, but took it seriously when he did. "He wrote me a letter," Dawson said. "Yes, when?" "The month before he died. He gave it to me with instructions he asked me to give it to you." She paused. Her fingers moved slightly on the table. "After he was gone." Dawson looked at her. "He died 2 years ago." The silence was long enough that the lamp flame seemed loud. "Yes," she said, "Lenora." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Why, don't ask me yet," she said. "Read it first." He picked up the envelope. His hands were steadier than he felt. He opened it carefully, because the paper was old and he didn't want to damage it, and that care felt important in a way he couldn't have explained. The letter was 2 pages in Harlan's hand. Close, deliberate writing. Dawson read it in silence. Harlan wrote the way he spoke. No preamble. He opened by saying that he knew he was dying and that he was using what energy he had left on things that mattered. He said he'd spent the better part of 2 years watching Dawson work, and he wanted Dawson to know what he'd seen. He'd seen a man who, in Harlan's words, had come to this ranch, like a man who'd been waiting all his life for a reason to moving and hadn't recognized it when it appeared. He'd seen a man who fixed things that weren't his job to fix and said nothing about it, who stayed through a February that would have driven off men half his age, who listened, which Harlan wrote was rarer than most people thought. And then the part that Dawson had to read twice. Harlan had written that he'd spent the last year of his life working with his lawyer on papers that would have given Dawson a legal stake in Ashwood Creek. Not charity, not sentiment. A genuine working partnership because the ranch needed it and because Harlan had decided Dawson had earned it. He'd planned to present it before he died. He hadn't moved fast enough. He asked Dawson to stay, not for the ranch, for Lenora, because he had watched his daughter fall in love with a man who refused to see it, and he had watched that man look at his daughter with an expression Harlan described as a man staring at something through glass he didn't believe he was allowed to touch. He said, "She needs someone who sees her, not her face. Her. She's been alone since her mother died, and she'll convince herself she's fine with it because that's what she does. Don't let her." Dawson folded the letter along its old crease lines. He set it on the table. He put his hands flat on the wood on either side of it. He didn't look up right away. When he did, Lenora was watching him with the expression of a woman braced for impact. 2 years, he said. Yes. You kept it 2 years. Yes. He watched her, waiting. He was going to need more than yes. She uncurled her fingers from around the coffee cup. She set it aside. She looked at the letter on the table between them, rather than at him. The week after he died, she said slowly, "I read it. I almost gave it to you the same afternoon." She stopped, pressed her lips together, and then I thought about what it said, what it told you to do. And she stopped again. "Say it," Dawson said. "Quiet. I didn't want you to stay because my father asked you to." The words came plain and flat, like something she'd rehearsed until the emotion wore off the surface of it. "I didn't want you to look at me differently because a dead man told you how I felt. I didn't want," she pressed a fist briefly against the table. "I didn't want to watch you decide you were obligated." Dawson's chest felt like something was sitting on it. "And I kept thinking I'd find a better time," she said, "when things weren't so tight financially, when the mortgage pressure was less. After we got through the spring or the summer, or when—" She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "It was always going to be after something. And then you told Cody you were going to Laramie." She looked at him directly. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of it was visible. "If you're leaving tomorrow," she said, "then I can't keep this anymore. Whether you go or stay, you deserve to have it the day I was given it. And that's on me. That's something I'll have to live with." Dawson sat very still. He thought about 20 years of moving. Thought about every reason he'd ever given himself for not planting his feet. He thought about the morning he'd walked into this barn for the first time and shaken Harlan Whitlock's hand and thought, "One season, and then I'll move on." He thought about everything he'd refused to look at for 3 years and looked at it now, all at once. "Why didn't you just tell me yourself?" he asked. Without the letter. Without any of it. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "'Cause I was afraid you'd leave anyway," she said. "And I didn't think I could watch that and still function." The lamp between them made small sounds in the quiet house. "Lenora." His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "I've been telling myself for 2 years that you were better off without me in the picture. That you'd make a sensible choice, and I'd make it easier on you by not being here to complicate things. That Silas or somebody like him was what you actually needed. I didn't ask for Silas." "No, you didn't." He looked at the letter. "I convinced myself it was the right thing, removing myself." Was that the only reason? He met her eyes. "No," he said. Scared. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not yet. Something more cautious than that. Something that had been clenched for a long time. "Scared of what?" she asked. He could have dressed it up. He didn't. "You," he said. "What I felt every time I was in the same room as you. What I knew I'd never stop feeling. And the absolute certainty that I was the wrong man for it. Too old, nothing to offer, no good reason for you to look at me twice." Lenora looked at him for a long time. "Dawson," she said finally, "you rebuilt half this ranch. You walked a sick horse all night in February. You stayed when my father was dying, and every other hand we'd tried had drifted off before spring." A pause. "You've been the reason I could keep this place running. For 3 years. And you thought you had nothing to offer. I don't have land. I don't have money. I've got a horse and a pair of saddlebags." "I have land," she said, with a directness that rocked him. "I don't need yours." He didn't have an answer for that. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The lamp flame bent slightly and steadied. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted. So Lenora said, very carefully, "If you're still leaving tomorrow." "I haven't said I'm leaving tomorrow." The silence that followed was a different kind than what had come before it. Something had been set down in it. Something heavy. "I need to think," he said. "I owe you honesty, and I'm giving you what I have right now, which is I don't know how to do this. I've been moving my whole life. I don't know how a man like me stays." "Maybe you learn," she said. Not harsh. Just honest. "Maybe," he said. He picked up the letter. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out toward her. "Keep it," she said. "He meant it for you." He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket over his heart, which was the only place that made sense for it. He looked at the woman across the table. 30 years old, chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, green eyes tired and open, and more honest than he deserved. Carrying the weight of a ranch, and 2 years of a secret, and a dead father's hope, and her own fear, and still sitting there, still looking at him without flinching. He thought, "Harlan, you were right about everything." Out loud, he said, "I'm not packing anything tonight." Lenora's shoulders came down by about half an inch. That was all. But he saw it. "Good," she said. "It doesn't mean." "I know," she said. "One thing at a time," he nodded. She wrapped her hands around her cold coffee cup and looked at the table between them, and for the first time that he could remember, she looked like a woman who had put something down that she'd been carrying too long. He sat across from her in the dim kitchen and thought about the morning and the north fence and the saddlebags sitting half-packed in the bunkhouse, and tried to figure out what, exactly, a man like him did when the reason he'd always given himself for moving on turned out to be the same reason he had to stay. He didn't figure it out that night, but he didn't pack anything else either. And in the morning, when Cody and Pete came in for breakfast asking who was riding what pasture, Dawson poured himself a coffee and sat down at the table and said he'd take the east section, and Lenora, passing him to reach the stove, said nothing, but the line of her shoulders was different than it had been in weeks. The letter sat in his shirt pocket all day. By evening, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. He didn't say it yet, but the saddlebags stayed where they were. And that night, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Dawson Rourke went to sleep without the particular ache of a man trying to convince himself he doesn't want what's right in front of him. It was still there in the morning. That ache didn't leave the way he'd hoped. But a different feeling had moved in alongside it, something quieter, something that felt less like need and more like presence. The feeling of being in a place where he was supposed to be. He didn't trust it yet. Old habits were slow to die. But he stopped fighting it. For now, that was enough. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. That counted for something. The saddlebags were still in the corner of the bunkhouse when he woke, exactly where he'd left them the night before. He looked at them for a moment in the early gray light, then pulled on his boots and went out to feed the horses without touching them. Cody and Pete were already up, moving around the barn with the efficient half-awareness of young men who had learned to function before they were fully conscious. Nobody asked about the saddlebags. Dawson hadn't told them he was going exactly, and he hadn't told them he was staying. And for now he was grateful that neither of them was sharp enough to notice the difference. Lenora was at the stove when he came in for coffee. She handed him a cup without looking at him directly, which was different from the night before. The night before she'd looked at him plenty. This morning she was giving him room, which he recognized as its own kind of consideration. She'd said what she had to say. She'd put the letter on the table between them and let it sit there. Now she was making breakfast and not watching him, and he understood that she was trying not to make him feel cornered. The problem was that he'd been making his cage for 20 years and hadn't noticed until someone opened the door. He sat at the table with his coffee and watched the back of her head and thought about the letter still folded in his shirt pocket. He'd slept with it there. Hadn't quite decided what to do with that fact. "East pasture fence held overnight," she said without turning. "Cody checked it before you were up." "Good. The new posts should hold better than the old ones." "They will." She moved a pan to the back of the stove. "Silas sent a note this morning." Dawson's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "This morning?" he said. "It's barely past 6. His man delivered it before dawn. He's prompt." She said the word prompt the way another woman might say something unprintable. She came to the table and set a plate down, then sat across from him with her own coffee. The note was on the table beside the sugar bowl. She hadn't opened it yet, or if she had, she'd refolded it exactly. He wants to meet with me at his office in town this afternoon. To hear your answer. That's my guess. Dawson looked at the note. And what is your answer? Lenora wrapped both hands around her cup. I don't have one yet. She met his eyes. Last night changed things. It changed the conversation. It didn't change your mortgage situation. No, she agreed, it didn't. He set the cup down. He needed to be careful here. Careful in a way that he'd never had to be before in his life, because he'd never had a stake in something like this. He'd spent his whole career working for people, making their problems right, and then walking away when the season ended. He didn't know how to have this conversation as someone who was, apparently, staying. He was still learning what staying meant. The debt, he said. How bad is it exactly? Not what I know from watching the actual number. Lenora looked at him for a moment, measuring something. $4,200, she said, due to the First Territorial Bank at the end of next month. Kept his face still. $4,200 was not a sum he could pull together in a month. He'd been saving for years with the particular discipline of a man who had no fixed expenses and no real needs, living on wages and rarely spending them. And he had something, a proper something, in a bank account in Cheyenne. But not $4,000. Not close. Silas offered to clear it, he said. Full, plus operating capital for the next 2 years. She looked at the table. In exchange for yes. Marriage. And the deed transfers to his name, with me as a beneficiary. Which means if the marriage doesn't work, I have no ranch, she said flatly. Correct. Dawson turned his cup slowly in his hands. That's not an offer. That's a transaction. I know what it is. Lenora. He waited until she looked up. Tell me what the horses are worth. All of them. The mares, the young stock, everything. Something shifted in her face. A very small thing, quickly controlled. Why? Because I want to know what I'm looking at. She hesitated. Then she said, on paper, based on what the market paid last season for comparable animals, somewhere between $1,100 and $1,500 for the current herd. Maybe more if the spring foaling goes well and the prices hold. She paused. Which wouldn't help me in 30 days. No, he said. It wouldn't. She stood and went to refill her coffee, and he let the silence sit. He was doing the arithmetic in his head the way he'd learned to do it over years of working ranches. The arithmetic of what was possible versus what was needed, and it didn't quite add up. Not yet. But he was looking for the piece that would make it work. The angle that wasn't visible from where they were currently standing, and he had a feeling, not certainty, but a feeling, that it existed. Go to Silas's meeting, he said. Lenora turned from the stove. What? Go to town, meet with him. Don't give him an answer. He met her eyes. Just listen to what he's offering. I need a few days. Dawson, I'm not telling you what to decide. That's yours. I'm asking for a few days to figure out if there's another option. If there isn't, if the numbers truly don't work, then you'll make whatever choice you need to make, and He stopped, because the end of that sentence had too many ways to go wrong. I'll respect it. She looked at him for a long moment. A few days, she said. 72 hours. If I can't show you something real by then, I'll stop pushing. She set her coffee down. What are you going to do? I'm going to ride to Cheyenne. That's 2 days hard riding. I know, he stood. I need to look at some things. Numbers. Options. I'll be back by Thursday, Dawson. Her voice had an edge to it that wasn't quite worry but was adjacent to it. I'm not a project. I don't need you to fix this. I know that. He held her gaze. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because he stopped, started again, because I'm trying to figure out if I've got something worth putting into this. And I need to know what the real situation is before I can do that honestly. A long silence. Thursday said. Thursday. She nodded once. That sharp nod. But this time there was something else behind it, not resignation. Exactly. Something more like a decision of her own being made. I'll hold Silas off until Friday, she said. 1 day of buffer. That's all I'm asking. He went to saddle Dusty. The letter shifted against his chest when he swung up into the saddle, and he put his hand over it for just a moment. Flat against the pocket, the way a man presses a bruise to check if it's real. It was real. He rode out before 7. The road to Cheyenne was 2 days in the saddle. Dawson had ridden it before in both directions, and he knew the landmarks, the long ridge that appeared on the left, about 6 hours in, the creek crossing near Harbin's old trading post, the particular stretch of open country where the wind came at you sideways, without any hills to break it and made your eyes water for an hour. He knew the road. He used the time to think. He thought about Harlan's letter, about the partnership Harlan had intended, about the fact that Harlan, a man who'd run a cattle and horse operation for 30 years, had watched Dawson work and decided he was worth a stake. Harlan Whitlock had not been a sentimental man about business. He would not have made that decision if he didn't believe it was sound. He thought about Lenora's horses. She'd said $1,100 to $1,500, current market, current herd. What she hadn't said, what he suspected she might not have fully calculated, was the trajectory. Because Dawson had been watching those horses, and he'd been watching Lenora with those horses, and the thing she was building was not something you could assess using last season's prices. He spent the second day of the ride going over it carefully in his head. The mares she'd selected, the temperament, the conformation, the consistency across the foals she'd produced. He'd seen what she was doing before he'd understood she was doing it deliberately, and when the understanding arrived, it had surprised him, which meant it would surprise everyone else too. He'd been around horses his whole working life. He was not easily surprised. The question was whether he could put together enough of an argument, enough of a case built on something concrete, to give Lenora a real alternative. Not hope, not comfort, numbers. She would not be moved by anything less. He reached Cheyenne on the evening of the second day and went directly to the bank where he kept his savings. He hadn't been inside in 3 years. The teller looked at his account balance, and Dawson looked at it with him, and it was more than he'd allowed himself to consciously calculate, because consciously calculating, it would have meant thinking about what he was saving it for, and for most of those years there hadn't been a for. He sat with the bank manager for an hour. Then he found a room at the boarding house on Fuller Street where he'd stayed before, and he lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what Harlan had written. He'd written, "The wandering cowboy had finally found somewhere he belonged." He just hadn't recognized it when it appeared. Dawson had read that line 4 times on the road, and each time it had felt like something pressing on a nerve. Not because it was wrong, because it was exactly right, and he'd spent 3 years pretending not to know it. The next morning, he rode back. He pushed Dusty harder on the return, not cruelly but with purpose, and made it to Ashwood Creek late on the second afternoon. He came in through the east gate, which was the long way, but let him see the pastures first. He always looked at the horses when he came back from anywhere. It was habit. He stopped Dusty at the gate for a minute. There were 8 mares in the east pasture, moving in the long-shadowed afternoon light. He knew each of them, their names, their histories, the specific difficulties that had made other ranchers sell them cheap. The buckskin with the old wire scar on her near foreleg that had healed wrong until Lenora spent 6 months doing something Dawson had never seen done before. Some combination of careful exercise and wrapping, and what he could only describe as negotiating with the horse until the scar tissue softened and the gait corrected. Buyers had called that mare unsound. Lenora had disagreed, and she'd been right. He looked at the mares in the evening light and saw what he'd been too close to properly see for 2 years. Then he rode to the house. Lenora came out of the barn when she heard hooves in the yard. She was wearing her work clothes, hair pinned up under her hat, and she had the look of a woman who had been working hard and not sleeping enough. She stopped when she saw him and did not immediately say anything, which was her way. "Thursday," he said. "You made good time." Pushed a little. He dismounted, and she came and took Dusty's reins without being asked, which was the kind of small automatic thing you did when you'd worked alongside someone long enough. "How was Silas?" "Confident," she said. He kept saying things like "when you've made your decision" rather than "if." She led Dusty toward the barn. "He's already got a foreman in mind." "Of course he does. The man's been waiting for me to fail for 2 years." He just dressed it up as courting. Dawson took Dusty back from her at the barn door. "I'll tend him. You look like you've been on your feet all day." "I'm fine, Lenora." She looked at him. "Let me tend the horse," he said. "Then I need to talk to you." Something in his tone, he could see her reading it, trying to determine whether what was coming was good or bad. She had that careful, braced quality about her again. "All right," she said. He took his time with Dusty, because the horse had earned it, and because he needed a few minutes to put his thoughts in order. He'd been rehearsing what he wanted to say on the road, but sitting in a saddle and standing in a barn were different things. He had a tendency to be blunt, which worked most of the time, but Bluntness without precision was just noise. When he came out of the barn, Lenora was sitting on the fence rail by the gate, watching the pasture. The sun was going down behind the mountains to the west, and the light was that particular amber color that made everything look like something worth keeping. She heard him coming and didn't turn. He came and leaned on the fence beside her, not quite touching. Close enough. I went to my bank in Cheyenne, he said. Turn then. I've got just over $3,000 in savings, he said. 20 years of wages from a dozen outfits, mostly unspent because I never had anywhere to spend it. He looked at the pastures. It's not 4,200, but it's close. Dawson, her voice had gone careful. Let me finish. He turned to face her properly. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a proposition. Harlan intended to make me a partner in this ranch. He didn't get the chance. I'm proposing something similar, but different. I put $3,000 toward the mortgage as a formal investment. We figure out the remaining $1,200 from this spring's breeding contracts and young stock sales. That buys you time to do what you're actually already doing with these horses, without Silas's name on the deed. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. That's everything you have, Lenora said. Most of it. And if it doesn't work? If the spring foaling is poor or the buyers don't come? Then I've made a bad investment, he said. Which is a thing that happens to people. 20 years of your life, Dawson. Yes. He held her gaze. I know that. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, the same way she worked through a problem with a difficult horse, patiently, systematically, making sure she wasn't missing something. She was not a woman who made important decisions based on feeling alone, which was one of the things he most respected about her. You didn't have to go to Cheyenne, she said finally. You didn't owe me that. I know I didn't. Then why? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about 20 years on the road, and every bunkhouse he'd slept in, and every outfit he'd moved on from, and the feeling of Harlan's letter folded in his pocket, pressing against his chest. Because your father saw something in me that I'd stopped being able to see in myself, he said. And I think it's about time I acted like it. Lenora looked away from him, toward the pasture, toward the mares moving in the amber light. He saw her throat move as she swallowed. If I take that money, she said slowly, we'd be partners. That's the idea. I've never had a partner, neither have I. It's complicated. When you're partners with someone and you also... She stopped. I know it's complicated, he said. I'm not pretending it isn't. Another long silence. The horses moved in the pasture. One of the mares lifted her head and looked at them across the fence, then went back to grazing. I need to tell you something else, Lenora said. Something I didn't tell you the other night because... She stopped again, which was unusual for her, and the stopping told him this was harder than what had already been said. All right, he said, steady. She got off the fence rail and stood facing the pasture. Her back wasn't quite to him, more angled, like she needed to look at something else while she talked. 2 years ago, she said, when I first read my father's letter and decided not to give it to you, part of my reason was what I told you. I didn't want you to stay because he told you to. A pause. But part of it was something else, something I'm not proud of. He waited. I was afraid, she said, not of you leaving, of what would happen if you stayed. She turned slightly. My father left everything to me. The land, the horses, the debt, decisions. And I've been making those decisions alone for 4 years. And I've gotten used to it. I've gotten used to being the only person accountable for this place. And the thought of Piautout through her nose, letting someone into the decisions, into the plans I'd made, even someone I trusted. She turned and looked at him. That scared me as much as anything. Dawson looked at her for a moment. That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of, he said. Kept your letter from you for 2 years. Out of fear. Not cruelty. It amounts to the same thing. It doesn't, he said. I know the difference. He shifted his weight on the fence. Lenora, I've spent 20 years making the wrong choice because I was afraid of the right one. I'm not going to hold 2 years of fear against you. She looked at him with an expression he didn't quite have a name for. Something stripped down. The face a person shows when they've run out of things to hide behind. The horses, she said. What you said about the horses. Do you actually believe that? That what I've been building is worth what I think it's worth? More, he said. I think you've been underselling it because you've been too close to it to see what it looks like from the outside. You're not just saying that. When have I ever said things I didn't mean? She almost smiled at that. Almost. Fair point. He stood up off the fence. Show me the breeding records. The ones you've been keeping. Now? When else? She looked at him for a moment. Then she pushed off the fence and headed for the house. He followed. She kept her records in the office off the kitchen, a small room with a desk and a window that looked out on the yard. The desk was covered with the organized chaos of someone who was doing too much work for the available space. She pulled out a ledger from the drawer, thick with her handwriting, and opened it on the desk. He leaned over it beside her, close enough that he could smell the faint horse and hay smell that had long since become inseparable from what he thought of as her, and he read. She'd been keeping meticulous notes for 3 years. Dam and sire information, foaling dates, temperament assessments at 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months a year. Notes on which mares had produced offspring with the particular quality she was breeding toward steady nerve, sound bone, a specific quality of attention that he'd noticed in her best horses and never had a word for until she wrote it in her ledger as tractable intelligence. Buyers wanted strong. Buyers wanted sound. Buyers who knew anything wanted what she was producing, and most of them hadn't seen it yet because she hadn't sold enough to show them. This, he said, pointing to a column she'd kept tracking the price differential between her sold horses and comparable animals from other ranches. Do you know what this shows? It shows my horses are selling about 15% above market, on incomplete information, on horses that buyers are treating as ordinary because they don't know what you know yet. He straightened. What happens to that differential when word gets out? I don't know, she said. It's still a small sample. How many foals due this spring? 6 confirmed, possibly 7. From the best mares? Yes. He thought about it for a moment. Then we've got until spring. After the spring foaling, if even 4 of those 7 are what I think they'll be. You think they'll be the same quality as the mothers? I think they'll be better, he said, because you've been selecting. Every generation you're refining. He turned to face her. Your father didn't know you were doing this. He knew some of it, not the full plan. He would have loved it. He said it simply, without sentimentality, as a plain fact. He would have seen exactly what it was. Lenora's jaw tightened for just a moment. She looked down at the ledger. He would have argued with me about the selection criteria for the first year, she said. He thought I was being too picky about the sires. And were you? No, a pause. But he would have come around. Dawson almost smiled. So, she said, what exactly are you proposing formally? Your $3,1200 from mortgage, split between my savings and whatever you can raise from the young stock before the deadline. Legal partnership agreement, drawn up properly by a lawyer in town. Equal say in decisions. 50-50 on the books, though I understand it's your father's land and the primary operation was built by your family. 50-50 is fine, she said. If you're putting in $3,000, you're entitled to 50%. I don't want it for the money. I know, she said. That's why it's fine. He looked at her. And the other part, she said. Her voice was even, but the steadiness of it cost her something. The non-business part. I'm not going to pretend I know how to do that correctly, he said. I'm 40 years old, and I've been a drifter my whole life. I'm going to get things wrong. Yes, she said. Probably. But I'm not going anywhere. If that means anything. It means something, she said. It means a lot. They stood in a small office with the ledger open between them and the lamp burning low, and outside the sound of the horses settling for the night, the particular comfortable sounds of animals secure in a known place. Then Silas's note, which Lenora had set on the corner of the desk earlier, crinkled in a draft from the window. They both looked at it. I'll send him a letter tomorrow, Lenora said. Her voice had gone back to level, the practical level she used for decisions she'd made, and wasn't going to unmake. Declining his offer. He's not going to take it well. No. She looked at Dawson. He's not used to being told no. Men like Silas rarely are. He'll make things difficult, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd already thought it through. He'll try, Dawson said. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame bent and steadied. We can handle difficult, she said. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who'd run a ranch alone through 4 hard years and kept a dead man's letter in a drawer for 2 because she'd needed to know the choice was real. Who'd built a horse breeding program in plain sight while nobody noticed because they were too busy seeing her face instead of her work. Who'd been afraid of letting someone in and had done it anyway. Yes, he said. We can. Outside, the wind came down from the north, carrying the first real edge of cold that meant the season was turning. One of the horses in the pasture called out a short sound, not alarm, just awareness, and the others shifted and settled. Lenora reached out and closed the ledger. She didn't move away from the desk, and he didn't step back, and for a moment they simply stood in the small space with the closed ledger between them and the lamp burning between them, and everything that had been unsaid for 3 years now said, imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that real things get said by real people who are afraid of them. "Thank you," she said, "for writing to Cheyenne." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have $1,200 to find." She almost laughed. "I know where to start." Good. He reached past her and straightened the lamp wick so it would burn cleaner. "Tell me in the morning. You look like you need sleep." "I look terrible," she said, matter of fact. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I've seen myself in a mirror." She picked up the lamp. "Dawson. The saddlebags." He looked at her. "When you came back tonight," she said, "they weren't on your horse." "No." "Where are they?" "Bunkhouse," he said. "Still in the corner." She nodded. That look again, the stripped-down one, before she put something back across it. "Good night," she said. "Good night." She took the lamp and went down the hall, and Dawson stood in the sudden dark of the small office for a moment before he found his way to the door. He crossed the yard to the bunkhouse in the cold, and he did not look at the saddlebags in the corner when he came in. He lay on his cot and stared at the low ceiling while Cody's quiet snoring marked the time. He thought about Silas Vane receiving Lenora's letter tomorrow. He thought about $1,200 in a month to find it. He thought about a man with small eyes who wasn't used to being told no, and the ways that men like that found to make good people's lives difficult when they felt they'd been wronged. And he thought about 8 mares in an amber-lit pasture, and a ledger full of handwritten notes, and a woman who had been building something extraordinary in quiet, and how close he had come to saddling a horse and riding away from all of it in the dark of an early morning. The thought of it tightened something in his chest. He pressed his hand to his shirt pocket. The letter was still there. He was still here. For now, that was the only arithmetic that mattered. Lenora's letter reached Silas Vane on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the first buyer had canceled. His name was Gerald Hatch, a rancher from the north end of the valley, who'd come out to Ashwood Creek 2 weeks earlier, looked at a pair of 2-year-old geldings Lenora had been preparing for sale, and shaken her hand on a price. He was a decent enough man, not sharp but fair, and when he sent his ranch hand with a note saying he'd changed his mind about the purchase, the note didn't offer a reason. Didn't need to. The timing said everything. Lenora read it at the kitchen table and set it down without expression. Dawson was sitting across from her with his coffee. He'd seen her read it. He watched her fold it. "Hatch," he said. "Yes, that was $200. I know what it was." She set the note aside and opened her ledger. "I still have Calloway interested in the buckskin filly. And Morrison said he'd come look at the yearling colts next week. Silas hasn't reached them yet." She looked up. "He may have." They sat with that for a moment. "How many buyers did you have lined up?" Dawson asked. 6 confirmed, 3 more possible. She looked at the column of names in the ledger. Hatch was the smallest sale. "If Silas is working through them in order of—" She stopped. "He's not working in order of anything," Dawson said. "He's working fast. He wants you panicked. I know what he wants." "Are you panicked?" She looked at him with an expression that said the question was not particularly appreciated. "No." "Good, then we think." He leaned forward on the table. "Who's the buyer you trust most? The one most likely to hold firm regardless of what Silas says?" She thought about it. "Frank Aldridge, up near Miller's Creek. He's been after the Buckskin Dam for over a year. He's not the type to let someone else's argument change his mind about a horse he wants. Can you ride out to him today, before Silas's people get there?" "I can ride out this morning." She was already closing the ledger. "Take the mare with you. Let him see her again." "I wasn't planning to leave her home." She stood. And there was something in the efficiency of the movement, the quick decision. No hesitation that reminded him of watching her work a difficult horse. She didn't fight the situation. She moved with it, found the gap, went through. He stood too. "I'll ride into town, talk to Morrison directly." "Morrison barely knows you. He knows I've been working this ranch for 3 years. That's a reference." He picked up his hat. "And I want to talk to the lawyer. We need that partnership agreement on paper before Silas starts suggesting to people that Ashwood Creek's ownership is complicated." Lenora paused in the doorway. "Is that a possibility, that he'd do that?" It's a possibility that he'd imply it. Men like Silas don't lie outright when they can do more damage with a suggestion. She absorbed that. All right. Town, lawyer, she looked at him. Don't let Morrison talk you down on price. He'll try. I know how to negotiate. I know you do. I'm saying don't let him. She almost smiled. Didn't quite reach her eyes this morning, but it was there. The yearling colts are worth what I'm asking. I'll get what you're asking. She went to saddle her mare. He watched her cross the yard, and he thought about the $1,200 they still needed, and the 30 days shrinking, and Silas Vane sitting in his well-appointed office somewhere in town, with the patience of a man who had learned that waiting cost him nothing. Then he went to saddle Dusty, because thinking about Silas was not the same as solving the problem. The lawyer's name was Everett Crane, an older man who kept an office above the dry goods store on the main street and had a reputation for being meticulous without being slow. Dawson had met him twice, both times briefly, both times on Harlan's business. Crane had done Harlan's will, and apparently, the partnership documents that Harlan had intended for Dawson and never managed to execute. Crane remembered him. Mr. Rourke, he said from behind a desk, covered in organized papers. I wondered if you'd ever come in. You knew about Harlan's intentions? I drafted the documents, Crane said. He asked me to hold copies in case they were needed. He folded his hands. I was sorry he didn't get the chance to present them to you himself. He was quite clear about what he wanted. Dawson sat down. We need new documents. Lenora and I are drawing up a formal partnership. Different terms than what Harlan intended, but the same general principle. Crane looked at him with the careful neutrality of a man who'd been a lawyer long enough to not show surprise at anything. Miss Whitlock is in agreement? It was a mutual decision. And the terms? Dawson laid out what they'd discussed. The investment amount, the equal partnership split, the protection of the deed in Lenora's name with shared operating authority. Crane listened, asked 3 precise questions, made notes. There's something else, Dawson said when Crane looked up from his writing. Silas Vane. Crane's pen stopped. He's relevant to this? He made an offer to Miss Whitlock. She declined it. He's now discouraging her buyers. Discouraging, Crane said carefully. Can you be specific? 1 confirmed cancellation as of this morning. No reason given, others likely. Dawson kept his voice even. He has reach in this territory. He can create pressure without leaving fingerprints. Crane set his pen down. He looked at the wall for a moment, in the way of someone sorting through what they knew. Silas Vane is a man who prefers his transactions to be orderly, he said at last. He doesn't typically operate outside legal boundaries. But the boundaries are wide. He looked at Dawson. The partnership documents are your best protection. Once they're filed and recorded, the ranch's ownership structure is a matter of public record. It becomes considerably harder for anyone to imply uncertainty about it. How quickly can you have them ready? If Miss Whitlock comes in to sign, I can have something in order by Wednesday. I'll have her here Tuesday. He left Crane's office and went to find Morrison. Morrison ran a cattle operation about 6 miles south of town and came in most Fridays to conduct business. Dawson found him at the feed store, which was logical, and introduced himself directly. He was a broad man in his 50s with a skeptical mouth and a habit of squinting at things before he commented on them. Rourke, he said. I know the name. You work Ashwood Creek. I'm a partner in it, Dawson said, as of recently. He held Morrison's gaze. I understand you were interested in the yearling colts. Morrison squinted at him. Word got to you fast. Miss Whitlock keeps good track of her buyers. He let a beat pass. Has anyone suggested to you lately that Ashwood Creek's horse stock might not be what it appears to be? Morrison's squint deepened slightly. Then slowly, it shifted into something more like recognition. Had a conversation this week, he said. Man I know, works for Vane's outfit. Mentioned he'd heard some things about the Whitlock breeding program. Said the bloodlines weren't as clean as advertised. And what did you think about that? I thought it was an interesting thing for a man who works for Silas Vane to say, given that Vane was courting Whitlock about a month back. He crossed his arms. I've been around long enough to know what a turf conversation looks like. Dawson liked Morrison immediately. The yearling colts, he said. Come out and look at them. Make your own assessment. Whatever that assessment is, I'll respect it. When? Monday. Bring whoever you want. Morrison uncrossed his arms. All right, he said. Monday. Dawson rode back to Ashwood Creek, feeling marginally better than when he'd left, which was not the same as feeling good. 1 buyer possibly salvaged, 1 possibly incoming, and the partnership documents in progress. Silas had a head start and more resources, and the kind of settled patience that came from never having worried about money. The arithmetic was still tight. He was unsaddling Dusty when Lenora came in. He could read her the way he'd learned to read weather, the set of her shoulders, the pace of her step. She'd had a mixed day. "Aldridge," he said, "he's holding." She hung her bridle on its hook. "He wants the mare. He's not going to let Silas Vane's opinion change his mind about a horse he's been watching for a year." She paused, but he warned me that 2 other ranchers he knows had already been contacted. Both of them were noncommittal when he asked. "Morrison's coming Monday," Dawson said. "That helps." She started on her mare's saddle. Calloway sent a note. "He's reconsidering his needs at this time." She said it flat, quoting, "which means Silas got to him." "That's 3, Dawson said. 3 confirmed gone or going." She set the saddle over the rail and rubbed the mare down without speaking for a moment. "I did the numbers this afternoon while I was riding. If we lose Calloway and the 2 Aldridge mentioned, and if Morrison doesn't commit, we're looking at roughly 700 from confirmed sales, plus the 3,000 from you. That's 3,700. 500 short. Yes." He leaned against the stall. "What about the breeding contracts?" "You mentioned those. I have 2 signed. Another 3 possible. But breeding contracts pay out over time, not in a lump sum. The bank won't accept a contract as payment, they want cash." Dawson turned that over. "What if we asked Crane about a short-term note? Bridge the gap between now and the spring foaling, when the value of those contracts becomes cash. The bank already holds our mortgage. They're unlikely to extend additional credit." She looked at him. "That's how it works when you're already behind. They don't lend you more to solve the problem the first loan caused. Not that bank, a different one." She was quiet. "Cheyenne has 2 other banks," he said. "I have a relationship with one of them. Depositor for 20 years. That means something. You take out a note on top of the investment to bridge $500 for 60 days until the spring sales." "Yes." She looked at him with that expression again, the stripped one. "Dawson, I know, this is not your problem to fix. It became my problem when I asked to be your partner." He said it steadily. "That's what partners are. People who share the problem." She stood very still in the middle of the barn. One of the mares in the far stall shifted. The hay smell and the horse smell settled around them. "I'm not used to that," she said quietly. "I know. I'm not either." He pushed off the stall. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, slowly. Not the sharp, decisive nod. Something more deliberate, like she was making herself absorb it rather than just processing it. The days that followed were a grinding exercise in uncertainty. Morrison came on Monday with his foreman and a taciturn ranch hand and spent 2 hours with the yearling colts, watching them move, checking their conformation, handling their feet, asking questions that were specific and knowledgeable. Lenora answered everything directly. She didn't embellish. She didn't sell. She simply showed him the animals and let him look. At the end of 2 hours, Morrison stood back and looked at the colts in the paddock and said, "These are better than I expected." "I know," Lenora said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. "Price stands at what you quoted." "Yes." He rubbed his jaw. "The bigger one. The gray, I'll take him." "The gray comes with a condition," Lenora said. "I want first right of refusal if you decide to sell him on." Morrison squinted. "You're that confident in his future value?" "Yes." Another pause. Then done. When Morrison's wagon rolled out of the yard, Dawson exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 days. "That's 240, Lenora said. "Running total? With Aldridge confirmed and Morrison committed, we're at roughly 3,340 against our investment. Still need 900 from somewhere. 3 breeding contracts," Dawson said. "They sign. If." The if hung in the air between them. It was a different kind of problem than money it was. The problem of things outside their control, the particular misery of having done everything right and still being subject to what other people decided. That Wednesday, Lenora went to town and signed the partnership documents in Crane's office. Dawson signed them beside her. Crane had them recorded at the county office before the day was out. When they walked back to the horses on the street, the ownership of Ashwood Creek was, for the first time, a matter of public record with 2 names on it. "How does it feel?" Dawson asked. Lenora thought about it honestly. "Strange," she said, "in a way I don't entirely dislike." He almost said something then. Something that had been accumulating pressure for days. He didn't. Because they were on the street in town where anyone could see them, and because there were still $900 to find, and because he'd decided he wasn't going to say the important things in fragments when there was still too much unresolved. She seemed to understand. She adjusted her hat brim against the sun and said, "We should get back. I have a mare I want to check on." "Which one?" "Rosie. Pregnant one. She's been moving differently the last 2 days." He fell into step beside her. Differently how? Restless. Not alarmed restless, just ready restless. She glanced at him. "She's close." "How close?" "Week, maybe." "Could be sooner." They rode back together, which they'd been doing more naturally lately, the two of them covering the same ground without having to decide to do it together. 2 days later, the first of the possible 3 contract ranchers came in. His name was Dell, a quiet man from outside town who raised working ranch horses with the practical eye of someone who needed animals that would hold up under real use. He'd heard about Lenora's program from Aldridge, who had apparently been talking to people without being asked. He spent a morning looking at the mares and the records and left with a signed breeding contract. That evening, Dawson was checking the fence line along the creek when he heard hooves coming fast from the direction of the house. He looked up. Cody, riding hard, face red. "She needs you," Cody said. "Rosie's foaling." "Something's wrong." He was back on Dusty and moving before Cody finished the sentence. By the time he reached the barn, Lenora was already in the stall with the mare. Rosie was down, sides heaving, and the foal was presenting wrong, one foreleg forward, one tucked, and that was the kind of problem that could kill the foal and the mare both if it wasn't corrected. Lenora's sleeves were already rolled up, her face set with the particular intensity she wore when she was working a problem she couldn't afford to get wrong. "I need another hand," she said without looking up. "Take her head. Keep her calm. Don't let her thrash." He dropped into the straw beside the mare's head and put his hands on her neck. Rosie was sweating through her coat, eyes showing white at the edges. He talked to her, low and steady, the wordless reassurance that horses responded to, not because of what was said, but because of the quality of the sound. Lenora worked with both hands, careful and precise, finding the tucked leg, repositioning. Took a long time. Cody had disappeared, for which Dawson was grateful, because Cody was not useful in a crisis, and being in the stall with him would have made Rosie more anxious. Pete stood at the stall door, not speaking, which was the most helpful thing Pete could do. At some point that felt like forever but was probably 30 minutes, Lenora made a sound that was not quite a word, a low, relieved sound, and then she was pulling gently and steadily, and the foal came into the world in a rush of motion and wet, and Lenora's hands guiding it to the straw. She sat back on her heels. The foal shook its head, drew its first breath, made a sound that was thin and startled and alive. Dawson looked at Lenora across the stall. She was breathing hard, both hands in the straw, covered to the elbow in the work of it. Her hair had come half down from its pin. She looked completely spent and not remotely defeated. She looked at the foal, and something happened to her face that was too private to describe properly. The years of selecting and waiting and deciding, all of it converging on this wet, shaking, indignant animal discovering its own legs in the straw. "Filly," she said. "She's strong," he said. "Yes," a pause. "Going to be something." He believed her. Then the morning 3 days later arrived with the thing nobody had anticipated. He woke before dawn to the sound of wind. Not normal wind, the sound that wind makes when it's changed its character, shifted into something with intent. He lay still for a moment listening to it, and then the tone of it reached some instinct trained by 20 Wyoming winters, and he was up and dressed before he was fully awake. He stepped out of the bunkhouse, and the cold hit him like a wall. The sky to the northwest was the particular darkness that wasn't night the swollen, pressurized dark of a sky with weather in it, moving fast and low. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. The wind was out of the north, carrying the smell of snow and something colder behind the snow. An early blizzard. He went straight to the barn. The horses were already uneasy, he could hear them before he got the door open, the restless shifting, and the particular unease of animals that could read weather better than any almanac. He was checking the latches on the paddock gates when Lenora appeared beside him, which meant she'd been woken by the same sound, or had never fully slept. "How bad?" she said, looking at the sky. "Bad," he said. "This is not a regular storm. The pressure dropped fast. This is the kind of system that comes down hard and stays." She absorbed that. "The mares. East pasture," he said. "I'll get them. I'll come. Get the barn ready first." Make sure every stall is clear, and he stopped. Both of them had thought the same thing at the same time. He saw it on her face. The breeding mares were in the east pasture. East pasture was bordered on its far edge by a ravine steep-sided, rocky, with a frozen creek at the bottom. In clear weather, the mares knew the ground and gave the ravine edge appropriate distance. In a whiteout, with the wind pushing from the north, they would drift downhill. Horses in a storm always drifted downhill, and downhill at the east pasture's far edge was the ravine. Rosie, Lenora said. The pregnant mare, the other pregnant mare, the one due in 3 weeks. Not the filly's mother. A different animal, heavier with foal, less able to manage rough ground at speed. I'll go now, Dawson said. Get the barn open. Send Cody and Pete after me when they're up. I'm coming with you. Lenora, I know that pasture better than you do, she said flatly. I know where each of those mares goes when they're frightened. You don't, she looked at him. We're wasting time. She was right. He knew she was right. 5 minutes, he said. Get the barn doors open and get back here. She was back in 4. They rode out as the first flakes began, small and hard and horizontal, driven by a wind that had found its full strength. The cold was a physical presence, the kind that worked through coat and wool and settled into muscle. Dawson kept Dusty moving at a steady pace toward the east pasture, not fast enough to be reckless in uncertain footing, not slow enough to let the storm get ahead of them. The gate to the east pasture was standing open. The latch had failed old hardware, on his mental list for replacement, not yet replaced. The wind had done the rest. How long have they been out? Lenora said, scanning the pasture. No way to know. He stood in the stirrups. Can you count them from here? She was already counting. I see 4. Should be 8. A pause. The wind pushed. They've gone to the far end. The far end where the ravine was. They rode. The snow was coming in earnest now, the visibility dropping by the minute. Dawson kept his eyes on the ground in front of Dusty, watching for ice patches, for the ground change that would tell him they were getting close to the ravine edge. He'd walked this pasture in good weather. He was translating it now to bad weather, accounting for the drift of snow that was already beginning to blur the landmarks. They found the first 2 mares 50 yards from the ravine edge. Both were stopped, heads down against the wind, aware enough of the ground change to have halted, but confused enough not to have moved back toward shelter. Lenora got around them and pushed them north, back toward the barn direction. They went reluctantly, unhappy about the wind in their faces, but they went. 6 more, she called over the wind. I see tracks, he pointed. Hoof marks in the new snow, already filling, leading south along the ravine edge rather than away from it. Horses that had been moving when the storm pushed them, following the line of least resistance, which in this case was the worst possible direction. They followed the tracks. The wind came in a gust that drove snow horizontal, and for approximately 10 seconds Dawson could see nothing. He kept Dusty moving, because stopping in a whiteout was how you got turned around. When the gust passed, Lenora was still beside him, lower in the saddle, and ahead through the gray and white, he could see the shapes of horses. 5 mares, bunched together, stopped at the very lip of the ravine. Below them, the slope dropped away sharply into the frozen creek bottom 20 feet down. The mares were standing with their tails to the wind, and 2 of them had their front feet on ground that would not hold weight. Rosie, Lenora said. He saw her, the heavy-bellied mare broadside to the ravine edge, starting to shift sideways under the push of another gust. Lenora was already moving. She came around the left side of the group, putting herself between the mares and the ravine edge, and she did it without appearing to think about it, which was either brave or something past brave, into a different territory entirely. Her horse was reliable, bless the gray mare, steady in ways most horses weren't. Dawson came around the right. Between the 2 of them, they created a wall, turning the grouped mares' attention away from the ravine and toward the north, toward where the barn was invisible behind sheets of snow. Move them slow, Lenora called. Rosie can't run. I know. They moved them slow. It was the longest half-mile Dawson had ridden in 20 years. Rosie moved with the careful deliberateness of an animal who understood her own limitations, which horses sometimes did and sometimes didn't, and this one did. And for that he was genuinely grateful. The other mares followed because horses followed other horses, and Lenora's mare kept them moving even when the wind tried to push them sideways. At some point, Cody appeared out of the gray with his horse, and Pete behind him, and the additional presence tightened the group and got the mares moving with more confidence. The barn lights appeared through the snow like something from a dream. The horses smelled it before they saw it, and their pace picked up of its own accord, and then they were through the barn doors and into the warm, and Dawson could hear each mare's breathing settling as the wind stopped being a fact of life. Counted. 8 mares. All present, he looked at Lenora. She was dismounting, running a hand down Rosie's side, checking. Her hair was completely down, now snow-wet, plastered to her face and neck. Her hands were shaking slightly, which he recognized not as fear but as the aftermath of sustained cold and sustained tension releasing at the same time. She was talking to Rosie in a low, continuous murmur, checking the mare's belly, her legs, the set of her hips. "She's all right," Lenora said. Her voice came out rougher than usual. "Cold, but all right." Dawson stood in the middle of the barn, with 8 horses around him, and snow melting off his coat, and the sounds of the storm against the walls, and he looked at the woman across the barn, and he thought about every reason he'd ever given himself for not doing this. None of them seemed real anymore. He crossed the barn. She was still focused on Rosie, checking the mare's near foreleg, and she didn't look up until he was close. When she did, she read his face, and something in her own face went still. "Don't say it now," she said quietly. "Not in a barn in a blizzard when we're both frozen and exhausted." A pause. "Say it when it'll keep." He almost said it anyway. Instead, he said, "Rosie's favoring her left front." Lenora looked at the leg. "It's superficial. She'll be fine," she straightened. "The others need to be checked. I'll start at the far end. I'll work toward you." They went to work. Outside, the blizzard settled in with the particular commitment of a storm that had been building for days, and the wind found every gap in the barn boards, and the temperature continued to drop, and the lanterns bent in the drafts. Inside, 8 mares stood in their stalls and ate their hay, and Dawson and Lenora worked their way toward each other down the barn aisle, checking legs and hooves, and the quiet vital signs of animals that had just had a harder night than they deserved. When they met in the middle, both of them done, all horses accounted for and sound, Lenora leaned against the stall rail and closed her eyes for a moment. "The mortgage is due tomorrow," she said. He'd known. He'd been keeping track. "We're still short," she said. "By how much?" $400. Maybe $350 if Dell's contract payment clears by morning. $350. After everything. After Cheyenne and the lawyer and Morrison and Aldridge, and the blizzard and the ravine, and 8 mares standing warm in their stalls. $350 between Ashwood Creek and the bank's patience running out. He looked at the barn around them, at the horses, at Harlan Whitlock's daughter standing snow-wet and exhausted in the lantern light, with her eyes closed and her jaw set against whatever she was feeling. He put his hand in his coat pocket. He'd kept something back from the Cheyenne trip. Contingency, because contingencies were wisdom. He'd told himself he'd use it as a last resort, and here was the last resort, wearing Lenora's face. "I have $380 in a separate account," he said. "In town, a smaller bank. I kept it back in case something went wrong." Lenora opened her eyes. He looked at her steadily. "That puts us over," she said, "by $30. She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern between them made small sounds. Rosie shifted in her stall. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "we go to the bank." "Yes." "Together." "Yes." She didn't say anything else. Pushed off the stall rail and went to get a bucket of water for the horses that hadn't drunk yet. He watched her go, and then he went to help, because that was what you did when you were partners with someone, and because somewhere in the last several days he'd stopped thinking about it as a decision and started thinking about it as just the shape of his life now. The storm blew through the night. By morning, it had deposited 18 inches of snow across the valley, and a silence so complete you could hear it. The sky was the particular pale blue of cleared air after a hard system, and the sun came up hard and white off the snow. Dawson was already up when Lenora appeared in the yard. She'd put her hair up and wore her good coat, the dark one she used for town. She was carrying the ledger under one arm and a folder of papers that would be the partnership documents and the breeding contracts and whatever else she'd assembled. He had Dusty ready. She looked at the horse, then at him. "Ready?" she said. "Have been," he said. They rode to town. The bank manager's name was Carver, a careful man who'd been holding Ashwood Creek's mortgage for 4 years and had watched Harlan build it, and Lenora nearly lose it. He sat behind his desk and looked at the papers Lenora laid in front of him, and the combined payment that covered the full amount. And he had the expression of a man who had expected a different conversation this morning. "This clears the outstanding balance," he said. "In full," Lenora said, "plus the quarter's interest." Carver looked at the partnership documents. Dawson's name next to Lenora's, at the breeding contracts, the sum in front of him. "The ranch is yours, Miss Whitlock," he said finally. "Free of this obligation." "Ours," she said. She glanced at Dawson. "The ranch is ours." Carver made whatever internal adjustment bankers make when a situation resolves differently than they anticipated. "Yes," he said. "Of course." They walked out of the bank into the cold winter sun and stood on the snow-packed street, and Lenora held the receipt in one hand and looked at it, and Dawson stood beside her and looked at the mountains above the town, white and enormous and permanent in the way mountains are. "He knows," she said. "Silas, he'll have someone watching. He'll know within the hour that we made the payment." "Yes." She folded the receipt carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "He's not going to let this go." "No," Dawson agreed. "He's not." She looked up at the mountains for a moment longer. Then she looked at him with eyes that were clear and tired, and something else. Something that had come through a hard season and found itself still standing on the other side of it. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. He met her gaze. "We are," he said. Silas found out about the payment before noon. Dawson had expected it would take an hour. It took 40 minutes. He knew because he and Lenora had stopped at the feed store on their way out of town, and when they came out with the loaded wagon, Silas's black horse was tied in front of the bank, and Silas's man was coming back out through the bank door with the specific expression of someone who has just confirmed bad news for his employer. Dawson watched him go without comment. Lenora had her eyes on the road ahead. "He moved fast," she said. "He was ready for either outcome," Dawson said. "Men like him always are." She was quiet for a moment. "What does he do now?" "I don't know yet. But he does something. He kept the wagon moving. He didn't get where he is by accepting no gracefully." That turned out to be accurate. 3 days after the bank payment, Dawson was in the east pasture, checking the fence line that the blizzard had compromised when Cody came out on horseback, with a look on his face that meant something had happened, and he wasn't sure how to say it. "Man in town," Cody said. "Lawyer type. He's been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Cody shifted in the saddle. He was 22 and earnest and not good at delivering complicated information. About the ranch. About the deed. About whether the partnership was, he used the word valid, I think. Whether it was valid. Dawson stopped what he was doing and looked at Cody directly. "Where'd you hear this?" "Morrison's hand was in town this morning. He heard the lawyer talking to a man at the land office." Cody paused. "The lawyer's name is Birch. He works for Vane." Dawson drove the last fence staple in, picked up his tools, and went back to the barn. Lenora was in the office when he came through the door. She looked up at his face and set her pen down. He told her. She was quiet through all of it. When he finished, she turned her chair to face the desk and looked at her hands for a moment. "He's questioning the partnership documents," she said. "He's trying to. There's nothing to question. Crane filed everything correctly. But if Silas can create enough uncertainty, enough public question about the ownership, he can make it hard for us to do business. Buyers get nervous when there's legal noise around a property." "That's the point," she said. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to make people hesitant." "Yes." She stood. "I'm going to talk to Crane. I'll come with you." "No." She said it without heat, just certainty. "I need to go alone. If you come, it looks like I need someone to speak for me." That's exactly the impression Silas wants people to have right now. That I'm not actually running this ranch, that the partnership means someone else is making the decisions. She picked up her coat. "I've been handling my own business in this town for 4 years. I'm not changing that now." He looked at her. She was right. He could see it, and it irritated him, and she could tell it irritated him, and neither of them changed position. "All right," he said. "Go." She went. He spent the afternoon doing the kind of work that required enough physical attention to keep him from thinking too hard about what Silas might be doing with the hours he wasn't watching. He repaired the section of east fence the blizzard had knocked flat, reset 3 posts, and checked every gate latch on the property, because the night the mares had gotten out had made him personally offended by every piece of failing hardware on the ranch. Lenora came back before supper. She stood in the kitchen doorway and took her coat off and hung it up and poured herself a coffee from the pot on the stove. All of it done with the controlled movements of someone organizing their thoughts before they spoke. Crane says the documents are solid, she said. Filed, recorded, and correct in every particular. Birch has been asking questions at the land office, but he hasn't filed anything because there's nothing to file. Then what's he doing? Crane thinks he's building a record. If he creates enough documented inquiry, even without a real challenge, it starts to look like there's an ongoing dispute, which is a different kind of pressure. She sat at the table. Crane also said something else. He said Silas has been talking to the First Territorial Bank. Carver, Dawson sat across from her. About what? About our future credit. If we ever need an operating loan, want to expand the operation, need bridge financing for a large sale, we'd go to the bank. Silas is making sure the bank thinks of Ashwood Creek as a complicated situation. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Not a bad credit risk. Just complicated. And banks don't like complicated. Can't close the bank to us. No, but he can make sure we're never their preferred customer. The lamp between them was the same lamp that had been there the night she'd laid the letter on the table. Dawson had started to think of it as a measuring point. How much had changed between then and now? 3 weeks ago, he'd been a man with packed saddlebags, trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Now he was sitting here with his name on a property deed, and the particular weight of someone who had put everything he had into one place. One person. One decision he couldn't take back and didn't want to. There's something I've been thinking about, he said. She looked at him. The horses, he said. What happens to Silas's leverage if we change what the horses mean in this territory? Plain. He leaned forward. Right now, Ashwood Creek's reputation is local. We sell to ranchers within a day's ride. We operate within a circle where Silas has influence. He put his hands flat on the table. But the spring foaling is coming. You've got 6 or 7 foals due from your best mares. And Morrison hasn't stopped talking. I heard from Pete that he mentioned the gray colt to 2 men at church last Sunday. I heard that too. Word is moving on its own, he said. We just need to move faster than Silas's lawyer. If buyers from outside this territory start coming to Ashwood Creek, before Birch can establish his narrative buyers from Laramie, from Casper, from operations big enough that Silas can't reach them, then the question of Ashwood Creek's validity as a business answers itself. Lenora was quiet for a moment. He could see her running through it. That requires people to know we exist, she said. Outside this valley. Morrison knows people. Aldridge knows people. You know people Harlan's contacts, the men he dealt with over 30 years. He held her gaze. And you have the foaling coming. When those foals hit the ground, and they're what I think they're going to be, that's the argument. Not us talking. The horses themselves. She was quiet for longer this time. Not doubtful he'd learned to read the difference between Lenora's silence of doubt and her silence of serious consideration. This was the second kind. My father used to show horses, she said. Not formally, just he'd invite people to the ranch. Let them see the operation. Make it an event, almost. She looked at the table. I never did it after he died. It felt like too much, managing the work and managing visitors at the same time. You wouldn't be doing it alone this time. She looked at him. I can manage the operations side, he said, while you manage the horses and the buyers. That's actually how a partnership is supposed to work. Corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile, and something more than a smile behind it. In the spring, she said, after the foals are on the ground and old enough to be seen properly. 4 weeks, maybe 5. She nodded to herself. We invite people. We do it right. That's what I'm thinking. Silas won't be able to stop people from seeing what's in this pasture, she said. Came out low and certain, and underneath the certainty was something that had been building for 2 years of quiet work, and 1 very long winter. No, Dawson agreed, he won't. The next morning, Dawson rode to see Morrison. He found the man in his barn, which was where useful men generally were in the morning, and Morrison listened to what Dawson was proposing with the focused attention of someone who was already calculating whether it applied to him. You're asking me to talk to people, Morrison said. I'm asking you to keep talking to people. You've already been doing it. Morrison looks at him sideways. The gray colt is every bit of what you said he'd be. Anyone who asks me a direct question is going to get a direct answer. That's all I'm asking, Laramie, Morrison said. There's a man named Gruber there. Runs one of the bigger operations in the territory. He's been importing horses from back east at considerable expense because he can't find what he wants locally. A pause. I think he might be very interested in what Miss Whitlock has been building. Dawson kept his face neutral. You think he'd make the trip? I think if I write him a letter and attach my name to it, he'd at least read it. Morrison rubbed his jaw. Gruber is the kind of man whose presence at your spring showing would bring 4 other serious buyers. He has that kind of weight. Would you write the letter? Morrison looked at him directly, the squinting, assessing look he'd used at the yearling viewing. Partnership with Miss Whitlock. That's real? Filed and recorded. And you're staying. I'm staying. Morrison nodded once, the nod of a man who had made a decision. I'll write the letter. Meanwhile, Silas was not standing still. 2 days after Dawson's visit to Morrison, a man named Tolbert appeared at Ashwood Creek. He rode up to the gate in the middle of the afternoon on a rented horse, not his own horse, a rented one, which said something about how far he'd come and how quickly, and announced himself as a land assessor sent by the First Territorial Bank for a routine evaluation of secured properties. Lenora came out to meet him. Dawson stayed in the barn. He stayed in the barn because Lenora had given him a look that meant stay in the barn, and he'd learned to read her looks. She spoke to Tolbert for 10 minutes in the yard. He could see them through the barn door without appearing to watch. Lenora's posture was open and relaxed, which he recognized as deliberate the posture of a woman who had nothing to hide and wasn't going to perform nervousness for someone who was looking for it. She showed Tolbert the receipt from the bank payment, pointed out the recorded partnership documents that she happened to have with her in the folder she'd been carrying to the office. She answered every question Tolbert asked without supplementing any answer with more information than the question required. After 10 minutes, Tolbert rode back the way he'd come. Lenora came into the barn. Routine evaluation, she said, in the precise tone one uses for quoting something. How routine, not remotely. Carver sent him. Silas talked to Carver. She set the folder on the feed bin. He wanted to see the deed and the mortgage release documentation, which you had, which I always have with me now. She looked at him steadily. I've been carrying the folder every day since we filed. He hadn't known that. Something shifted in his chest. Smart, he said. Necessary. She picked the folder back up. Tolbert's going to report that everything is in order. Because it is. And Silas is going to have to find a different angle. He will. I know he will. She sounded tired. Not defeated tired, which was different. I just need the spring to come. Dawson, I need the foals on the ground. It's weeks, he said. Maybe 5. She nodded. Went back to the house. He stood in the barn in the middle of what had become his life and thought about patience and about how the people who won long contests were not always the ones who moved fastest, but the ones who could sustain their position while the pressure built, and about how Lenora Whitlock had been doing exactly that for 4 years before he'd ever understood what he was watching. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of cold weather that's wearing itself out, a series of hard days warming incrementally towards something that might eventually become spring. Silas's lawyer Birch continued his quiet work at the land office, creating his paper trail of inquiries that led nowhere but looked busy. Silas himself was seen at a ranchers' meeting in town, speaking at length to 3 men who ran operations adjacent to the valley, which Crane reported was likely an effort to establish a coalition of voices that might give weight to whatever challenge he was building. But the spring was coming regardless of what Silas intended. The first foal arrived on a Tuesday morning from the buckskin dam the mare with the old wire scar that Lenora had spent 6 months rehabilitating. A colt, dark bay, on his feet within an hour, with the steady deliberateness of an animal that had somewhere to be. Lenora watched him with the focused attention of someone doing assessment rather than admiring, and Dawson watched her doing it. Well, he said. He's right, she said. He's exactly right. It wasn't a word he'd have used, but he understood it. The colt was the product of 3 years of selection, and the selection had worked. And looking at the animal, you could see it in the quality of his attention, in the way he moved once he'd steadied, in the particular proportion of head and neck and shoulder that Lenora had been breeding toward without having a name for it that anyone else would recognize. The second foal came 4 days later, the third after a week. By the time Gruber's reply arrived his letter to Morrison, forwarded to Dawson, there were 4 foals on the ground and a 5th imminent, and the word had been moving through the territory for 3 weeks. Gruber's letter was brief. He would come. Morrison sent a note the same day. Gruber's coming, and he's bringing Harwick and probably Slade. Harwick ran the second-largest cattle operation in the southern part of the territory, and Slade was a horse trader with connections to buyers as far as Denver. Dawson read the note to Lenora at the kitchen table. She read it again herself. Then she looked up. "That's 3 buyers we didn't have last week," she said. "That's 3 buyers Silas can't reach," Dawson said. She set the letter down on the table. "We need everything ready. The barn needs, I'll handle the barn. The paddocks need to be, I'll handle the paddocks. The record should be, Lenora." He said her name quietly. She stopped. "I'll handle the barn and the paddocks. You handle the horses and the buyers. That's the plan." She looked at him. "Right," she said. "That's the plan." They had 10 days. They spent them well. Cody and Pete were given specific responsibilities rather than general tasks, which improved their usefulness considerably. The barn was cleaned and organized until it looked like what it was, a working barn with nothing to hide. The paddocks were repaired to standard. The foals were allowed to simply be themselves in the pasture, which was the most persuasive thing they could do. And then Silas moved. 9 days before the scheduled showing, a document was filed at the county land office. Dawson heard about it from Crane, who sent an urgent note, and he rode to Crane's office and sat across the desk and listened while Crane explained it. "It's a challenge to the original land patent," Crane said. He had the document in front of him, and his voice was level in the way that voices are when someone is working hard to project calm they may not entirely feel. Birch filed it on Vane's behalf. "He's arguing that a clerical error in Harlan Whitlock's original patent, filed in 1861, creates uncertainty about the eastern boundary of the property." Dawson stared at him. "A clerical error from 1861. Yes. Is there one?" Crane looked at the document. "There may be a minor inconsistency in the surveying language. It was common in that era the original surveys were not always precise. Whether it creates genuine uncertainty about the eastern boundary is a legal question that would take time to resolve. How much time? If Silas pushes it aggressively, he could keep it in contention for 6 months. Possibly longer, 6 months. Past the spring showing. Past the breeding contracts. Into the period when the operation's momentum would either build or stall. "What's the eastern boundary actually worth?" Dawson asked. "To him. Not much," Crane said. "It's pasture. Useful to you, modest to anyone else." He folded his hands. "Which is how I know he doesn't want the land. He wants the noise." Yes. 6 months of unresolved land challenge creates exactly the kind of uncertainty he's been building toward. Buyers become cautious. Partners become nervous. Operating credit becomes difficult. It doesn't have to win in court, it just has to exist. Dawson sat back. He thought about what he knew about Silas, which at this point was a fair amount. He thought about what Crane had just said. He thought about Lenora's father filing a land patent in 1861, and a minor surveying inconsistency that had sat unremarked in the record for 26 years because nobody had needed to use it. "Who did the original survey?" he said. Crane looked at the document. "A man named Ehlers, standard territorial surveyor." "Is there a survey map on file?" "There should be." "The land office. Can we get it today if we go now?" They went. The map was in the land office archive, which was a back room that smelled like old paper and the particular dusty patience of things nobody had looked at in years. The clerk found it in 20 minutes and spread it on the counter, and Crane and Dawson looked at it together. Dawson was not a surveyor. He knew enough about land and fence lines to read a map with reasonable competence, and he looked at the 1861 survey and the notations in Ehlers' handwriting and compared them to the modern boundary as Crane read it from the recorded deed. "There," he said. He put his finger on a notation in the survey margin. Crane looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a reference mark." "It's a reference to a second document," Dawson said. He noted an amended survey, 1863. The clerk, who had been standing politely to the side, said, "We might have that in the secondary file." The 1863 documents were separated out when we reorganized in 79. The secondary file took another 30 minutes to locate. The 1863 amended survey was there. It had a small notation stamped across the top, partially obscured by a water stain from some long ago leak. But the content was clear. The amended survey corrected the eastern boundary notation, resolved the inconsistency in the original language, and had been filed and acknowledged by the territory. Birch had either missed it or chosen not to look. Dawson looked at Crane. Crane had the expression of a man who had been a lawyer for many years and had learned not to show too much satisfaction in a public room. "This resolves the challenge," he said, with precise understatement. "Can you file a response today?" "I can file a response within the hour." Dawson thought about Silas, about small eyes that were used to getting what they looked at, about a man who had decided that Lenora's beauty was a kind of weakness, that her financial difficulty was a kind of surrender in progress, that patience and money and the right kind of pressure would eventually move her where he wanted her. He thought about Harlan's letter, folded in his shirt pocket, since the night Lenora had handed it across the table. "File it," he said. He rode back to Ashwood Creek. Lenora was in the paddock with the newest foal, a filly from the Gray Dam, running her hands down the animal's legs, with the focused attention of someone cataloging information. She looked up when she heard hooves in the yard. She read his face the way she read everything directly, without flinching. He dismounted and came to the paddock fence, and told her about the challenge and the 1,863 survey and Crane filing the response, all of it in order, leaving nothing out. She listened without interrupting. She was still holding the filly loosely by the halter, and the filly was trying to investigate Dusty's bridle through the fence, and Lenora let her, which was the kind of small detail that told him she was processing hard and needed her hands occupied. When he finished, she said, "He's been planning this for weeks, at least." And the 1,863 survey was just sitting there. Yes. She looked at the filly for a moment. "My father knew about the amendment. He mentioned it once, years ago, when I was very young. I didn't remember it until right now. He filed it himself. He hired Ehlers back to correct it, after a neighbor disputed something about the same boundary. It was resolved and he never thought about it again." She looked at Dawson. He would have assumed anyone looking at the record would find both documents. Birch looked for the problem without looking for the solution. "Yes." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That's what happens when you go looking for something specific. You find what you're looking for and stop there." She let the filly go. The animal trotted off toward the other foals along the fence. "It's over," she said. "The challenge? Crane thinks Birch will withdraw rather than argue a case that has a filed resolution from the same era. It would embarrass him and waste Silas's money. And Silas." Dawson looked at her. "He'll try something else, Lenora. I don't think we should expect him to be done." "No," she said. "I don't think so either." She came through the paddock gate and latched it behind her. "But he's running out of angles." She stood on the same side of the fence as him and looked out at the pasture where 8 mares grazed and 5 foals tested their legs, and the Wyoming mountains stood white and enormous against the blue sky, and Ashwood Creek lay around them in the particular quiet of a working place in the early hours of a day that hadn't gone wrong yet. "Gruber comes in 4 days," she said. "Yes. And Harwick and Slade. And whoever else Morrison talked into coming." She was quiet for a moment. "What if they don't see what I see? What if they look at the foals and see ordinary horses?" "They won't. You can't know that. I've been around horses my whole life," he said. "I know ordinary from what you've built. They're not the same thing." She looked at him. "You were right about that from the beginning. I saw it in your face the first time you watched the foals in the paddock. You tried to hide it. I wasn't hiding it. You had your neutral expression on. My face." She made a sound that was definitely a laugh, brief and genuine. He hadn't heard that exact sound from her in a while, and it landed in him somewhere important. 4 days, she said. 4 days. She walked toward the barn, and he fell in beside her. And they covered the ground together, the way they'd been covering ground together, for 3 years. The same distance between them, the same rhythm. Except that it was different now, and they both knew it was different, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Gruber arrived on a Thursday. He was a tall man, weathered past 60, with the hands of someone who'd worked horses personally, rather than only employing people to do it. He drove himself in a wagon, rather than arriving on horseback, which Dawson found interesting and Lenora appeared to take as a positive sign. He brought a younger man who turned out to be his son, and behind Gruber's wagon came 2 other rigs, Harwick and Slade, as promised, plus a third man nobody had expected. A buyer from Casper named Eldredge, who had heard about the showing through a chain of conversation that passed through Morrison and Aldridge, and 2 men Dawson had never met. They stood in the yard, 6 buyers, more than Lenora had been expecting, All of them looking at the pastures with the evaluating eye of people who knew what they were looking for. Lenora introduced herself. She didn't introduce Dawson first. She introduced the horses.
She walked them through the paddocks herself, talking about each animal with a specific knowledgeable language of someone who had lived with these horses through their development.
Not selling, explaining. There was a difference, and Gruber in particular seemed to notice it. He asked questions, technical questions, questions about dam and sire selection, and the temperament criteria, and the specific work she'd done with the buckskin's rehabilitation. She answered all of them, without hesitation and without embellishment. Harwick was quieter than Gruber. He stood at the paddock fence and watched the foals for a long time, and when he finally spoke, it was to Dawson, who was standing nearby. "How old is that dark bay colt?" 6 weeks, Dawson said, from the buckskin dam. "She have a scar on her near foreleg?" "She does. I saw that mare 3 years ago when Whitlock brought her out. She was unsound. Different horse now. Different work done on her," Dawson said. Harwick looked at the colt. "The dam's quality is in him. That's been the consistent result," Dawson said, "across the foal crop." Harwick turned to look at him with the direct appraising look of an experienced man who was deciding whether to take someone's word on something. "You've been here how long?" 3 years. "Partner now." "Yes, her decision or yours, mutual," Dawson said. Harwick looked back at the colt. "She knows what she's doing." "Yes," Dawson said, "she does." By the end of the afternoon, Gruber had made an offer on 3 breeding contracts, not the foals, but guaranteed future access to Lenora's top mares, structured over 2 years. It was more money than any single sale Ashwood Creek had made. Slade had committed to the gray colt with Morrison's right of first refusal honored, which he'd been told about up front and had accepted without objection. Eldridge wanted 2 fillies from the next foaling year, pending confirmation of specific dam-sire pairings, and asked if a contract could be structured to reserve them. Lenora came back to where Dawson was standing at the end of the day, when the buyers' wagons were working their way back down the road toward town. Stood beside him and watched them go. "Gruber's contracts alone," she said. Her voice was very even. "That's more than we needed for the mortgage. That's more than we needed for the whole year." "I know. He wants first option on next year's foal crop after the contracts are filled." "Lenora." He turned to look at her. She turned too. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something big and trying to keep it from showing and not entirely succeeding. Her eyes were clear and tired, and something underneath both of those that he'd been watching for long enough to recognize. "He saw it," she said. "What I've been building. He saw it and he put money behind it." "Yes," Dawson said, "because you built something worth seeing." The afternoon light came across the pastures from the west, and the foals were moving along the far fence, and the mares grazed behind them, and the mountains were what they always were. Silas Vane arrived the next morning. He came alone, which was unusual. No man, no lawyer, no advance notice. He rode into the yard on his black horse and sat it for a moment, looking around. Dawson was at the woodpile. He put the axe down and stood where he was. Silas looked at the paddocks, at the foals, at the barn that had been cleaned and organized and was now just a working barn in good order. He looked at Dawson without expression. "Gruber," he said. "Was here yesterday," Dawson said. "Yes, Harwick and Slade. Both of them." Silas sat his horse and was quiet for a moment. The silence had a different quality than their previous silences. Something had gone out of it that had been there before. The particular quality of a man who has been very confident for a very long time and has just encountered something that confidence didn't account for. Lenora came out of the barn. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at Silas with the open, level expression she used when she'd already decided something and was waiting for the other person to catch up. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I underestimated what you were doing," he said. It wasn't quite an apology. It wasn't trying to be. "Yes," Lenora said. "You did." He looked at the pasture again. The foals. At the hole of Ashwood Creek, lying in the morning light, with its fence line straight, and its horses moving, and its deed filed in 2 names at the county land office. "The land challenge will be withdrawn," he said. "It already is," Lenora said. "Crane filed the response 3 days ago. Birch withdrew yesterday afternoon." Silas's jaw moved slightly. He looked at Dawson. "You found the 1,863 survey." "It was in the archive," Dawson said. "Not hard to find if you looked at the full record." Another silence. Silas gathered his reins. He looked at Lenora one more time, and this time it was the look of a man actually seeing something he'd been looking at wrong for 2 years. "Your father would have been pleased," he said. "Not warm. Just accurate." "I know," Lenora said. Silas turned his horse and rode out through the gate. Dawson picked up the axe. He looked at Lenora in the barn doorway. She was watching Silas's horse diminish down the road, and her expression was complicated, not triumph, not relief, something more thoughtful than either. The expression of someone who has carried a weight long enough that when it lifts, the lifting itself takes getting used to. "Is it over?" she said. Not to him, not to anyone. "Just the question." "I think he's done," Dawson said. "He's got too much else to manage to keep spending it on a fight he's already lost." Turned back toward the barn. "The Gruber contracts need to be reviewed with Crane, and the Eldridge reservation needs language. Tomorrow," he said. Paused. "Today," he said, "you should sit down for 10 minutes and not manage anything." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who found this advice impractical. 5 minutes, he said. "On the fence. Looking at your horses." Pause. 5 minutes, she said. She came out into the yard and sat on the fence rail and looked at the pasture, and Dawson leaned on the fence post beside her and did the same. The foals were moving along the far fence in the particular loose-limbed way of young horses, discovering what their legs could do. The mares watched them with the patient attention of animals that understood something important was happening and were willing to give it room. "Dawson," Lenora said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, still looking at the pasture. "Ask me." He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders. "What do you want?" he said. "What actually, honestly, do you want?" She turned from the pasture and looked at him directly, the green-eyed directness that had been making him feel seen for 3 years. "The ranch," she said. "The horses, you," she held his gaze. "But only if you want it too. Not because of the letter. Not because of the debt. Because it's what you want." He looked at her. "I threw my saddlebags in the dirt," he said. "That morning in the blizzard. I didn't think about it. I just did it." He held her gaze. "That's what I want." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded. Not the sharp, decisive nod. The other kind, the slow one, the kind that meant something had settled. Turned back to the pasture. He stood beside her on the fence. 5 minutes became 20. Neither of them counted. The 5 minutes on the fence became a habit. Not every day, and not always at the same time, but often enough that it became a thing they did, standing or sitting at that particular rail, looking out at the pasture, not always talking. Sometimes Lenora had her ledger. Sometimes Dawson had a coffee going cold in his hand. Sometimes one of the foals would come to the fence looking for attention and interrupt whatever silence they were keeping, and they'd deal with the animal and then go back to it. Cody noticed. He mentioned it once to Pete in the barn, not quietly enough, and Dawson heard it and said nothing. And Pete punched Cody in the arm and told him to mind his own affairs. And that was the last time it was mentioned out loud. The Gruber contracts were reviewed with Crane and signed within the week. The language Eldridge wanted for the Philly reservation took 3 drafts to get right, but they got it right. Slade came back 2 weeks after the showing with a banker's draft for the gray colt and hauled the animal back to wherever Slade operated from. And the colt left the yard looking over his shoulder at the mares in the pasture with the particular expression of a horse that wasn't sure about this development but was too proud to say so. The operating situation at Ashwood Creek changed in the span of about 30 days in ways that were real but took time to feel real. The mortgage was gone. The breeding contracts represented money coming in over 2 years rather than the single-sale scramble that had defined the previous 4. Dawson's savings, most of them, were now equity in the ranch, which was a different relationship with money than he'd ever had money. Not as a portable thing you carried against bad luck, but as a stake in something fixed. Something that would be there tomorrow and the day after. He thought about that sometimes. What it meant to have a stake. He thought about his father, who had been a drifting man before him, not a bad man, not an absent man, but a man who'd never quite landed anywhere and had raised a son in the image of that restlessness without meaning to. Dawson had carried that restlessness like a second skin for 20 years. Been so inside it, he'd mistaken it for his own character rather than something he'd inherited and never questioned. Lenora's father had seen through it in 2 years of observation. It had taken Dawson himself considerably longer. One evening in late spring, with the last of the foals on the ground and the Wyoming air finally carrying warmth rather than just the memory of it, he went to Crane's office alone. He'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks and hadn't told Lenora. which was unusual for him. Now they talked most things through, the practical things, the financial things, the decisions about the horses and the operation. But this one he needed to figure out himself first, because it was a different kind of decision than the ones they made together. Crane looked up from his desk when Dawson came in. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "is there a problem?" "No problem," Dawson said. He sat down. "I want to talk about the partnership structure." Crane set his pen down carefully. "In what regard?" "When we filed the documents, we structured it as an equal investment partnership. My money against 50% of the operating authority." He looked at his hands, then at Crane. "I want to change it." Crane was quiet. "Not the split," Dawson said. "I'm not asking for more. I want to restructure how my share is held. Instead of an investment stake, a purchased share, I want it to reflect something different." He paused, trying to find the right legal language for something that was not primarily a legal matter. "I want my contribution treated as a permanent investment in the property, not a stake I could pull out, not something that could be divided if the partnership dissolved, something that belongs to the ranch itself." Crane looked at him for a long moment. Careful neutrality of a man who had drafted a lot of documents and knew when someone was working toward something they hadn't fully named yet. "That kind of structure," Crane said slowly, "is most commonly seen in marital property arrangements." Dawson met his eyes. "Yes," he said. "I know." Another silence. "I see," Crane said. He picked his pen back up. "I can draft language that would accomplish that. It would need Miss Whitlock's signature as well, obviously." "Obviously." "Shall I draw up the documents?" "Please." He rode back to the ranch in the long evening light, and he thought about what he was doing and whether it was the right way to do it, and decided that it was exactly the wrong way to do it, and he was going to do it anyway. Because there was no right way to do something like this, and waiting for one was how men like him ended up alone. Lenora was at the fence when he rode in. Actually at the fence, as if she'd been there a while, watching the mares move in the last of the day's light. Turned when she heard Dusty's hooves. "Where'd you go?" she said. "Town." He dismounted. "Had something to do." She looked at him with the direct reading look. He held it. "You're going to tell me," she said. "Not a question." "I'm going to tell you," he agreed. "Not right now. Give me a day. I need to think through how to say it." "That bad?" "No." He looked at her steadily. "The opposite." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the pasture. "All right," she said. "A day." He told her the next evening. Not at the fence. Inside, at the kitchen table, with the lamp between them, which was where they seemed to have all their important conversations, he'd noticed. Something about that table, that lamp. Harlan had probably sat at the same table with the same lamp and had his own important conversations, and there was a comfort in that continuity that Dawson couldn't have explained to anyone, but felt clearly. He told her what he'd asked Crane to draft and why. She listened without interrupting, which was harder for her than she made it look. He could tell by the way her hands moved slightly on the table. When he finished, she said, "You went to a lawyer before you talked to me." "Yes," that she stopped. "That's very Dawson of you." "I know. I needed to make sure I actually meant it before I said it. Because once I say it—" "You mean it," she said. "I've never meant anything more." She looked at the lamp. "You're not asking me to marry you." "Not yet," he said. "I'm asking you to know that I'm not going anywhere. That whatever I have is here. Before I ask you anything else." She was quiet for long enough that he started to think he'd done it wrong, misjudged something, moved in the wrong direction at the wrong time. Then she looked at him, and the thing he saw in her face was not what he'd been afraid of. "Dawson," she said, "you threw your saddlebags in the dirt in a blizzard and went into a whiteout to pull 8 horses back from a ravine." She paused. "I already knew you weren't going anywhere. I wanted it on paper." Something happened in her face that he didn't have a word for. Something that had been held carefully for a very long time and was very slowly being allowed to put itself down. "All right," she said. "Put it on paper." They went back to Crane's office together. They signed the amended documents together. Crane filed them the same day, and the record of Ashwood Creek at the county land office was updated to reflect an arrangement that was, as Crane had noted, most commonly associated with a different kind of legal status. And if the clerk at the land office had opinions about that, he kept them to himself. Walking out of Crane's office that afternoon, Lenora said, "You know what people are going to assume." "Yes," Dawson said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her. "Does it bother you?" She considered it honestly, which was her way. "No," she said, "not particularly." "Then we're in agreement." She made the sound that was her version of a laugh when something struck her as both absurd and right. They walked to their horses. The summer that followed was the hardest work Dawson had done since he couldn't remember when, and also the best summer of his life, which he filed away as information about himself that he should have had earlier. The breeding program needed management at a scale it hadn't needed before. Gruber's contractrix meant a specific full crop requirement by the following spring, which meant the fall breeding had to be deliberate and precisely documented. Lenora managed the selection with the same systematic patience she'd always used, but the volume had increased, and Dawson took over the record-keeping and the scheduling and the logistics of bringing the selected sires in from neighboring operations, which involved a negotiation he'd not expected to be good at and turned out to be reasonably good at, because negotiating was mostly about listening, and he'd been doing that his whole life. Cody turned out to have a better eye for horses than either of them had given him credit for. Lenora noticed it first, as she noticed most things first, and she started including him in her assessments in a way that was teaching without announcing itself as teaching. By midsummer, Cody was doing preliminary evaluations on the yearlings with a vocabulary and a methodology that he hadn't possessed 6 months earlier. Pete left in August. He was homesick for Kansas. He mentioned it with increasing frequency until it became apparent that the only reasonable response was to let him go. They gave him his full season's wages, and Lenora gave him a reference letter that was specific and honest, which was the best kind. And Pete rode out on a Tuesday morning looking equal parts relieved and guilty. Dawson hired a hand named Garrett to replace him, an older man in his mid-30s who had relevant experience and the particular competence of someone who didn't need to be told the same thing twice. The ranch settled into the shape of itself. That was the way Dawson thought of it, not that things became perfect, because they didn't, because no working operation with animals and weather and equipment and the constant arithmetic of what needed doing against what was possible ever became perfect. But it settled. It found its shape. The days had a logic to them that made sense, and the work had a direction that made sense, and the people doing the work understood their roles in a way that made the whole thing move without constant friction. And in the middle of all of it, every few days, the fence rail and the pasture and the horses, moving in whatever light the day had decided to provide. In September, Lenora found him in the barn one evening replacing a broken halter buckle, which was the kind of small necessary task that filled the margins of every day on a working ranch. She sat on a hay bale and watched him work for a while without saying anything, which he'd come to understand meant she was working up to something. "Ask," he said. "My father's letter," she said. "You still have it." "Yes." "Do you ever read it?" He kept working on the buckle. "Sometimes." "What do you think about when you read it?" He was quiet for a moment, threading the leather through the new hardware. "I think about what he saw that I didn't see. And I think about what I would have done if I'd gotten it 2 years ago instead of the night before I was leaving." "What would you have done?" He looked up at her, honestly. "Always. I think I would have panicked," he said. 2 years ago. I think I would have convinced myself it was obligation. Told myself the respectable thing was to not take advantage of a dead man's wishes. Saddled Dusty and ridden to Laramie. Lenora was quiet. "I needed those 2 years," he said. "As much as I hate that I did. I needed to watch you work and watch this ranch and let things be real before they were named." He looked at the halter. "Your father was right about everything. But if he'd gotten his timing the way he wanted, I might have run." She absorbed that. "And now? Now I couldn't run if I wanted to." He looked at her. "I don't mean I'm trapped. I mean I don't recognize the version of myself that thought leaving was the right answer. That man feels like someone I used to know." She looked at him for a long moment. "He's not gone," she said. "He's just incorporated." "What does that mean?" "It means you still know how to leave," she said. "You just stopped wanting to." She turned the hay bale slightly. "I think that matters. I think there's a difference between a man who stays because he doesn't know how to go and a man who stays because he's chosen it." He hadn't thought of it that way. He thought about it now, sitting in the barn with the September evening coming through the gaps in the board siding, and found it was true. He still knew the road. He still knew how to pack light and move fast and not look back. That knowledge hadn't gone anywhere. He'd just stopped reaching for it. "Ask me," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "You came in here to ask me something," he said. "Not about the letter. Something else." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the spring showing," she said. "Gruber wants to bring more buyers this time." He mentioned men from Denver, from Salt Lake. She looked at her hands. That's a different scale than what we've been doing. It is. It means we'd need to be able to guarantee volume, not just quality. That means expanding the breeding program, more mares, more careful selection, more documentation. She paused. It means more investment, not money necessarily. Time, commitment, Lenora, he set the halter down. Are you asking me if I'm still in? I'm asking you if you want to do this, she said. Not whether you'll honor the partnership documents, whether you want it to be your life. He looked at her sitting on the hay bale in the September barn light, her hands in her lap and her green eyes direct and slightly uncertain, which was unusual for her. And he understood that the uncertainty was not about the horses or the business. It was older than that. The uncertainty of a woman who had been the only person responsible for everything for a very long time, and was still, in the deep down places, waiting for the other shoe. Come here, he said. She came off the hay bale and came toward him, and when she was close enough, he took her hands, which were calloused and capable and slightly cold, and held them. This is my life, he said. These horses, this land. You. He held her gaze. Specifically and completely, yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, good. Because I told Gruber we'd be ready. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. Course you did. The documentation system needs to be expanded. I've been working on a classification structure that tomorrow, he said. Tell me tomorrow. She stopped talking about the documentation system. He married her in October, beneath the cottonwoods beside the creek that ran along the south edge of the property, because the cottonwoods had gone gold with the season, and the creek was still running clear before the cold locked it, and because it was the most beautiful place on the ranch, and it was their ranch, and there was no good reason to do it anywhere else. It was not a large wedding. Crane came, because Crane had been so deeply involved in the legal architecture of what they'd built that excluding him would have been strange. Morrison came with his wife, a quiet woman who turned out to have opinions about horses that were surprisingly well informed. Aldridge came. Garrett, who'd been at the ranch 3 months, stood in the back with the slightly awkward dignity of someone who is new to a place and is being included in something old. Cody cried, which surprised everyone, including Cody. He turned red and wiped his face with his sleeve and pretended it hadn't happened and nobody mentioned it to him, which was the right call. The ceremony was short because Dawson and Lenora were both people who trusted substance over duration, and what needed to be said was said, and what needed to be promised was promised. And when it was done, they stood beside each other under the gold cottonwoods, with the creek running behind them, and the mountains in the distance, and the horses visible in the pasture beyond the fence. And it was imperfect and cold and exactly right. Morrison shook Dawson's hand afterward, with the firm grip of a man expressing something he wouldn't put into words. His wife embraced Lenora and said something quiet into her ear that made Lenora close her eyes for just a moment, and Dawson didn't ask what it was. That evening, after the guests had gone, and Cody and Garrett had gone to the bunkhouse, they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the ranch settling around them into its nighttime sounds. And Lenora opened her ledger out of habit, looked at it, and closed it again. Not tonight, Dawson said. No, she agreed, not tonight. He reached into his shirt pocket. He'd been carrying the letter since the night she'd handed it across this table, and it had traveled with him to Cheyenne and back, through the blizzard and the courthouse and Crane's office, through the summer and the September barn conversation and today. The paper was soft along the folds from handling. He laid it on the table between them. They both looked at it. We should put it somewhere, he said. Somewhere it'll keep. Lenora got up and went to the desk in the corner office. She came back with a small wooden box that he recognized it had sat on that desk since before he'd arrived at Ashwood Creek, one of Harlan's things that had stayed where Harlan had left it. She opened it and placed the letter inside and closed it, and set it on the corner of the kitchen table. There, she said. There, he agreed. She looked at him across the table. The same lamp. The same table. A different situation in almost every particular. He would have liked today, she said. Yes, Dawson said. He would have argued about the location. He would have wanted it in the yard, not by the creek. He liked the yard. And you like the creek. The creek is more private. She looked at the box. He would have conceded the point. He was good at conceding when he was wrong. He was. They sat with that for a while. The lamp burned steady. Outside, one of the horses called out a short, comfortable sound, an animal in a known place, and then was quiet. The years that came after were not easy years, because there are no easy years in ranching, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never done it. There were hard winters and a drought year that shrank the creek to a trickle and required hauling water in ways that Dawson's back still reminded him of in cold weather. There was a sickness that moved through the eastern pasture one spring and took 2 mares before Lenora identified it and stopped it. And she didn't sleep properly for 2 weeks after, because the ones she'd lost were ones she'd built from the beginning, and losing them felt like losing years of work, and something more than that. There were disagreements. Real ones, not the kind that dissolve when someone apologizes. They disagreed about the fall breeding selection 2 years running, and both times Dawson turned out to be partially right, and Lenora turned out to be partially right, which was a specific kind of argument outcome that required both people to be secure enough not to need to win. They were mostly imperfectly secure enough. They disagreed about Cody, when Cody showed enough talent with the horses that Lenora wanted to bring him into the breeding program decisions formally. And Dawson thought the boy was good, but not yet ready for that kind of responsibility. Lenora won that disagreement, and Cody spent 6 months proving her right, and then spent 6 months proving her right more dramatically, which Dawson acknowledged straightforwardly, and which Lenora was gracious enough not to revisit. The operation grew the way a well-managed thing grows, not explosively, not without setbacks, but steadily, in the direction it was pointed. Gruber's second showing brought buyers from Denver. The Denver buyers brought their own contacts. By the 3rd year, Ashwood Creek's waiting list for breeding contracts was longer than they could fill in a single season, and the decision to expand the breeding herd required the kind of careful capital planning that Dawson handled, and Lenora reviewed, and they argued about it, and came to a number they both believed in. The name traveled. Not everywhere, not yet, but further than Lenora had imagined when she'd been sitting alone in the small office with her ledger, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work before the bank took the ranch. Ranchers in Laramie knew it. Buyers in Denver knew it. A man who'd come from back east for a land purchase stopped at Ashwood Creek on his way through after Morrison mentioned it, and left with a breeding contract and a letter of introduction to Gruber that Lenora wrote on his behalf, because that was you built a network by connecting people to other people rather than keeping them to yourself. Silas Vane never returned to Ashwood Creek. He operated his cattle empire the way he always had, and the territory was large enough that their paths rarely crossed. And when they did, the encounters were brief and civil in the surface way of 2 people who have nothing left to negotiate. Whatever he decided about the whole business, he kept it to himself. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the end of a thing that had run its course. Harlan's letter stayed in the wooden box on the corner of the kitchen table. It became one of those objects that accumulates meaning by its presence, not looked at every day, but known to be there. Part of the inventory of the house and the marriage, and the ongoing conversation between people who'd loved the same man and carried that love differently. One evening, several years in, Dawson came in from the barn to find Lenora sitting at the kitchen table with the box open in front of her. She wasn't reading the letter. She was just looking at it, the way you sometimes look at things that matter, rather than looking at something specific in them. He hung his coat, poured himself a coffee, sat across from her. "Thinking about him?" he said. "Always a little." She looked up. "I was thinking about what he wrote, the last part, about what he saw in you, that I'd found somewhere I belonged and didn't recognize it. That," she said. "And the other part, about me." She closed the box gently. "He saw that I was going to convince myself I was fine alone. He was worried about that. Were you? Going to be fine?" She considered it. "Functionally, probably. I'm capable of being alone. I know how to do it." She looked at him. "But there's a difference between managing and living. I don't think I knew the difference until you stopped packing." He looked at his coffee cup. "I almost didn't stop. I know. I was very close to being someone who rode to Laramie and spent the next 20 years wondering." He looked at her. "That version of me is real. He just went a different direction at a fork." "He would have been miserable," Lenora said, without sentimentality. "Just fact." "Yes," Dawson agreed. "He would have." Dawson's saddlebags hung from a peg inside the barn. He'd put them there, the morning after the blizzard, when everything had been resolved, and the horses were safe, and the mortgage was on its way to being paid. And he'd walked into the barn with the bags in his hand and looked around for somewhere to put them that wasn't on his horse, and the peg on the wall had been the obvious answer. He'd hung them there and walked out, and they'd stayed. He passed them every morning. They'd been packed and repacked so many times over 20 years that the leather had the particular softness of things that have been handled constantly, and they still had the brass buckles he'd replaced twice because the originals had worn through. Good bags. They'd served him well across a lot of country. He didn't miss them. That surprised him more than anything else about the life he'd landed, in not that it was good. He'd hoped it would be good, but that he didn't miss the road. He'd expected to, in the way people expect to miss things they've done their whole lives. He'd expected some part of him to wake up restless and wanting to move, to find the staying a constant low-grade effort. It wasn't. The wanting had simply gone quiet, not because he'd suppressed it, but because it had gotten what it was looking for. He understood something now that he hadn't understood at 40. Restlessness is not a character trait. It's a symptom. He'd been restless his whole life because he hadn't been anywhere that wanted him back the right way. Once he was, the restlessness had nothing left to do. That was the thing he'd have told his younger self, if younger selves could be told anything useful. Not stay. The younger version of him would have fought that. But look at why you're leaving. Look at whether leaving is actually solving anything, or whether it's just movement for its own sake, because movement feels like progress when you don't know what you're moving toward. Lenora found him one evening standing in the barn looking at the saddlebags. She'd come to check on a mare that had been slightly off her feed, and she passed him on her way to the stall and stopped. Still thinking about leaving, she said. He turned. She was looking at him with the direct, green-eyed look, and behind it was the particular warmth that had been there for years. The warmth she'd stopped trying to hide some time in the first year after they married, because there was no longer any purpose to hiding it. No, he said, just remembering. Remembering what? He looked at the saddlebags on the peg. At 20 years of moving, and the object that had made it possible, hanging still and empty, and exactly where he'd put it on a February morning after a blizzard. How close I came, he said, to riding past all of this. She came and stood beside him, and they both looked at the bags. Would you have come back, she said, if you'd gone to Laramie? Eventually. Do you think you would have come back? He thought about it honestly, the way she'd always required him to think about things. I don't know, he said. I'd like to think so. But I was very good at convincing myself that the right choice and the easy choice were the same thing. He looked at her. I'm glad we don't have to find out. She nodded. Then she went to check her mare. He stayed a moment longer in front of the saddlebags, and he thought about what it had taken, not a dramatic gesture, not a single moment of clarity, but a letter read by lamplight, and a woman who'd been afraid to give it, and a blizzard that had made one decision very simple by making everything else irrelevant. Most of the important things in his life had worked that way. Not the big dramatic choice, but the small one that preceded it. Not the moment he stayed, but the moment he stopped packing. There is something that men like Dawson Rourke take a long time to understand, if they ever understand it at all, that the freedom they've been chasing, the freedom of no obligations, no fixed address, no one depending on them, is not the same thing as the freedom that comes from choosing to be somewhere. First kind protects you from loss. The second kind requires you to risk it. And the second kind is the only one that actually builds something. Lenora had understood this for longer than she'd admitted. She'd built her whole horse program on a version of it, the willingness to commit to animals other people had given up on, to invest time and work and faith in outcomes that weren't guaranteed, to stay with something through the difficult middle, when nothing was visible yet except the direction. It's the same skill. In horses and in people. You look for the thing that's worth the work, and then you do the work, and you don't leave in the middle just because the middle is hard. Dawson didn't consider himself a wise man. He was a man who had learned certain things later than he should have and was honest about the delay. But if anyone had asked him, and over the years, occasionally, someone did, a younger hand, a man in town with that particular restless look he recognized, he would have said, the thing you're running from is mostly yourself. And yourself will be waiting at every destination. So you might as well stop somewhere worth stopping and figure out what you actually want. He wanted this. This was what he wanted. He walked out of the barn into the evening air, and Lenora was at the fence, finished with the mare, her ledger tucked under one arm and her eyes on the pasture where the descendants of her original mares ran with the particular ground-eating movement she'd been selecting for across 3 breeding cycles. They were remarkable horses. He'd been around horses his whole life, and these were remarkable. He came and leaned on the fence beside her. She didn't look at him. She was watching the horses. "The gray filly," she said. "The one from Rosie's line. She's ready to be assessed for the program." "How do you know?" "The way she moves when she thinks nobody's watching," Lenora said. "She covers ground like she's been doing it for years. She's 2 years old." "Yes." A pause. Some things come ready. He looked at the filly in question, moving along the far fence with the easy, almost careless precision that Lenora had been breeding toward and had, by this point, largely achieved. She was right. The animal was ready. He looked at Lenora looking at the horse she'd built, from a selection made in the first year her father was dead, a decision made alone in a hard season, with no guarantee of anything, and he thought about patience, about what it actually costs, about how the people who talk about patience usually mean waiting. But real patience is different. It's working, and not knowing, continuing when the outcome isn't visible, staying with a thing through all the days when staying is invisible and unremarkable, and nothing about it feels significant. She had done that, for years before he'd understood what he was watching. He had done it too, in his way, though he'd been doing it blind and without the vocabulary for it. 20 years of moving and working and being reliable, without knowing what he was reliable for, until Ashwood Creek. The sun was going down behind the mountains in the way it went down in Wyoming, which was not subtle. The sky went colors that had no right to be that vivid, and the mountains went dark against them, and the pasture went amber. And the horses moved through the amber light like something out of a dream, except that it wasn't a dream and had never been one. It was just a ranch in Wyoming, with real fences and real debt and real weather and real work, and 2 imperfect people standing at the fence, looking at what they'd built together out of fear and stubbornness and a dead man's letter and a blizzard, and the particular grace of 2 people who had, finally, stopped deciding for each other and started deciding together. "Good evening," he said. Not to her, to all of it. Lenora looked over at him. He was smiling at the pasture. It was not an expression she saw on him constantly still, even now, which was why, when she did see it, it still registered. "What are you smiling at?" she said. He looked at her. Nothing specific. She looked at the pasture, and then back at him, and then she looked at the horses again, and after a while she was smiling too, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, which was its own kind of language, and they understood it perfectly. The saddlebag stayed on the peg, the letter stayed in the box, and Ashwood Creek stayed what it had always been trying to become, when the right people finally let it.